I bled for my son. At 68 years old, I worked 4 grueling physical jobs on bad knees to pay off what I thought was his life-threatening World Cup gambling debt. I believed a father's ultimate sacrifice could save his family from ruin. Then, standing in the freezing rain outside a luxury country club, I heard him laughing. He called me a stupid old man to his wealthy friends, bragging about how my sweat was funding his next luxury vacation. This is the story of how a tired old high school football coach stopped playing defense and systematically dismantled his corrupt son's entire life. Before I share the details of this betrayal and the justice that followed, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Your support helps me share these hard truths. Some minor details have been changed for privacy, but the pain and the dad revenge you will hear are entirely real. The freezing November rain soaked right through my thin security uniform jacket as I stood on the back patio of the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was a Tuesday night. My fingers were completely numb, clutching a damp manila envelope tightly against my chest. Inside that envelope was $4,500 in crisp $100 bills. It was the absolute last penny of my savings combined with 2 weeks of wages from my 4 different jobs. My son Bradley had called me 3 days earlier, weeping uncontrollably on the phone. He told me the dangerous men he owed money to for his disastrous World Cup bets were losing their patience. He swore they were threatening to hurt his wife, Sarah, and my 2 young grandsons if he did not hand over the cash by midnight. He told me to bring the money to the club, where he was working late, to appease his boss. I believed him. I always believed him. For 40 years, I was a high school history teacher and the head football coach at our local public school. I spent my life teaching young men about honor duty and sacrifice. When my wife Catherine passed away 5 years ago from breast cancer, I sat by her hospital bed and held her fragile hand. I promised her I would always look out for our boy. I promised her I would never let him fall. Bradley knew about that promise, and he weaponized my grief against me. I walked around the side of the clubhouse because I did not want to embarrass him by walking through the front lobby in my muddy work boots and cheap uniform. My knees ached with every step, echoing the years of standing on cold football fields. I approached the glass patio doors, ready to tap gently on the window. The lights were bright inside the private dining room. I expected to see him sweeping floors or doing paperwork to pay off his debts. Instead, I saw my son holding a heavy crystal glass of whiskey, surrounded by 3 other men in tailored suits. They were laughing uproariously. The patio door was cracked open just an inch to let the thick cigar smoke out into the night air. I stepped closer, raising my hand to knock when I heard my own name. Bradley took a slow sip of his expensive drink and smiled. He said his dad was the most reliable automated teller machine in the entire state of Ohio. One of his friends leaned forward and asked how he managed to afford the massive down payment on the new boat. Bradley laughed out loud, a sound that cut through the freezing rain and pierced my soul. He said he just told the old man a couple of Russian bookies were going to break his legs over a soccer bet. He said the stupid old man took a night shift at a warehouse just to make sure he did not miss out on his Cabo vacation next month. He told his friends I was probably driving there right now in my rusted-out truck to hand-deliver his weekend spending money. The whole room erupted in laughter. I stood completely frozen in the rain. My heart physically ached with a sharp stabbing pain right in the center of my chest. For 2 years, I had worked myself into the ground. I drove an auto parts delivery truck at 5 in the morning, lifting heavy brake rotors and batteries. I worked the cash register at a local hardware store all afternoon, smiling at customers while my back screamed in agony. I stood outside in the freezing cold as a security guard at night. I spent my weekends hauling mulch and mowing lawns. My hands were heavily blistered, my joints were shot, and I had skipped my expensive blood pressure medication for 3 months just to save a few extra dollars for him. I did it because I loved my son, and he was using my blood and my sweat to buy boats and vacations. I did not barge in. I did not scream or throw the envelope at the glass. 40 years of coaching taught me that acting on pure blind rage only gets you penalized and throws the game away. You have to watch the field understand the opponent's strategy and wait for the perfect moment to strike. I lowered my hand slowly. I slipped the envelope of cash deep into my inside coat pocket. As I stepped backward into the dark shadows, a waiter carrying a large silver tray of empty glasses pushed through the patio door. I turned quickly to hide and lost my footing on the wet stone steps. My right knee slammed hard into the concrete. A sharp, blinding jolt of pain shot up my leg, and the cheap fabric of my uniform pants ripped open. The waiter called out into the dark, asking if anyone was out there. I held my breath, pressing my back flat against the cold, wet brick wall of the building. Bradley told the waiter from inside that it was probably just a raccoon digging in the trash. A raccoon. That is exactly what I was to him. A nuisance in the dirt. I limped across the dark, empty parking lot to my old Ford pickup truck. The moment I sat in the cold driver's seat, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out with violently shaking hands. It was a text message from Bradley. The message said, "The guys are sitting in a dark car outside my house right now, and Sarah is terrified, so please tell me you are almost here with the money, Dad." I stared at the glowing screen in the dark cab of my truck. The sheer, calculated evil of his lie made my stomach churn. He was sitting in a warm, luxurious room drinking expensive whiskey, typing a message perfectly designed to terrorize a loving father. The conflict in my mind was deafening. Part of me wanted to march back in there, drag him out by his tailored collar, and throw the phone in his face. But the colder, harder part of me realized that if I confronted him now, he would just make excuses. He would find a way to manipulate the situation, or worse, he would cut me off from my 2 grandsons completely. I needed absolute, undeniable proof of everything he had stolen. I needed to know exactly how deep his lies went before I burned his world to the ground. I wiped the cold rain off my phone screen and typed my reply. I told him my truck broke down on the highway, and I was waiting for a tow truck in the freezing rain. I said I would have to deposit the cash directly into his bank account as soon as the bank opened in the morning. I told him to lock his doors and keep the boys safe. Almost immediately, he replied with a sad face emoji and thanked me for saving his life. The sheer hypocrisy made my blood boil in my veins. I started the truck and drove straight to my night shift at the freight warehouse. I limped heavily into the small, poorly heated guard booth and locked the heavy metal door behind me. I had 6 long hours until dawn. I opened my weathered laptop and connected to the spotty warehouse internet. 2 months ago, Bradley had begged me to open a joint checking account so I could deposit the debt payments directly. He claimed the dangerous bookies wanted the money wired from a clean account that had my steady work history attached to it. Because my name was on it, I had full online access. I had never looked closely at the outgoing transfer history because I always just deposited the cash and trusted my son to handle his desperate business. Tonight I clicked on the transaction history tab and set the filter for the past 24 months. The screen loaded slowly, and the truth hit me like a runaway freight train. There were no wire transfers to shady offshore accounts. There were no strange cash withdrawals that looked like payoffs to violent loan sharks. Instead, I saw a consistent, systematic funneling of my hard-earned money into a portfolio of high-end luxury expenses. There was a charge for $800 at an exclusive day spa. There was a monthly automatic draft of $1,200 to a luxury European car dealership. There were thousands of dollars transferred directly to a high-yield private investment account registered solely under Bradley's name. Every single time I had handed over cash, sweating and bleeding to keep my son safe, he was depositing it and using it to fund a millionaire's lifestyle. He was building his wealth on my broken back. While I was scrolling through a massive charge for a private golf instructor, a heavy fist pounded violently on the glass of the guard booth. I jumped, slamming the laptop shut. A massive 18-wheeler was idling loudly at the gate. The driver was standing outside my window, glaring at me through the driving rain. I opened the sliding window, and the bitter wind howled inside the tiny booth. The driver yelled at me, asking if I was deaf or just stupid, demanding I open the gate so he could finish his route and go home to his family. He told me to do my simple job before he reported me to the warehouse manager. The disrespect stung deeply, but I swallowed my pride. I nodded, silently, took his damp paperwork with my freezing hands and hit the green button to open the heavy steel gate. As the massive truck roared past, splashing muddy water against the booth, I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. I looked old, tired, and incredibly pathetic. But behind my tired eyes, a brand new fire was burning hotter than anything I had felt in decades. Bradley thought I was just a weak-old pack mule. He had absolutely no idea what a father could do when he finally realizes his unconditional love has been weaponized against him. By the time my warehouse shift ended at 6 in the morning, my battle plan was beginning to take shape. I knew I could not just cut him off abruptly. If I stopped paying suddenly, he would know I found out, and he would immediately hide his assets or use my grandsons as emotional leverage to punish me. I had to build a watertight trap. I had to let him think he was still in total control, while I quietly dismantled his foundation piece by piece. I left the warehouse and drove to my morning job delivering auto parts across the city. Every heavy brake rotor I lifted, every heavy battery I hauled up a flight of stairs, fueled my determination. My back screamed in agony, but I welcomed the pain. It was a constant physical reminder of exactly what I was fighting for. At 9 o'clock, I took my 15-minute break and drove to the local bank branch. I deposited the $4,500 into our joint account, just like I promised. Then I drove to Bradley's massive suburban house. It was a sprawling 4,000-square-foot property in a gated community that I now realized I had practically paid for with my blood. I knocked on the heavy oak front door. A minute later, Bradley opened it. He was wearing expensive silk pajamas and looking perfectly rested. When he saw me standing there in my damp, dirty security uniform, he immediately put on a mask of pure panic and relief. He grabbed my shoulders and pulled me inside the warm foyer. He asked eagerly if I made the deposit. I told him yes, the money was in the account, and the men should be satisfied. Bradley let out a long, theatrical sigh of relief and hugged me tightly. He said I was his hero, and that he did not know what he would do without me. Over his shoulder, I looked down the wide hallway. Leaning against the wall near the garage door was a brand new set of custom titanium golf clubs. They still had the shiny plastic wrap on the heads. The price tag dangling from the leather bag said $2,400. My son pulled away from the hug, looking me right in the eyes with absolute fake sincerity, and said he promised this was the last time. He swore on his mother's grave he was going to get his life together. I looked at the expensive golf clubs, then back at his lying face. I forced a tired, gentle smile. I told him I knew he would, and that a father always does what is necessary for his family. He smiled back, completely unaware that the countdown to his utter destruction had just begun. The game was no longer about a fake betting debt. The game was now about taking back every single thing he had stolen from me and making sure he lost the one thing he cared about most, his public image and his money. I left his house and got back into my truck, but I did not drive away immediately. I sat parked down the street watching his driveway. 10 minutes later, the garage door opened. Bradley pulled out in a pristine white luxury SUV, heading off to the country club, or wherever he spent his days pretending to work. As soon as he was out of sight, I pulled my truck back up to the house. I knew Sarah was still home. Sarah came from a wealthy, prominent family, and she had always treated me with a polite but very distant condescension. She thought I was just a poor, uneducated laborer who had failed to provide properly for my son. I realized then that she might not know the truth either. Or worse, she might be fully complicit in the scam, laughing at me behind closed doors just like he did. I had to find out before I made my next move. I walked up to the door and rang the bell. Sarah answered, holding a cup of gourmet coffee, wearing designer yoga pants. She looked surprised and slightly annoyed to see me back so soon. She asked if I forgot something. I kept my voice low and shaky, playing the part of the terrified father perfectly. I asked her if the men in the dark car had hurt her last night. I asked if the bookies had tried to break into the house while she was sleeping. Sarah stared at me with a completely blank expression. She blinked twice, entirely confused. She asked me what on earth I was talking about, saying nobody was outside the house last night and that she and the boys had simply watched a movie and gone to bed early. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Sarah had absolutely no idea about the fake gambling debt. Bradley was running this scam entirely on his own, hoarding the cash for his personal toys and secret accounts, lying to his wife about his income and bleeding me dry in the process. I quickly backtracked, acting completely confused. I told her I must have misunderstood something Bradley said, blaming my severe exhaustion and my old age. I apologized for bothering her and hurried back to my truck. As I drove away, my hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My son was not just a thief. He was a master manipulator who was playing his entire family like a chessboard. But he had made one fatal error. He assumed the old man was too tired, too stupid, and too blindly loyal to ever look closely at the board. He was wrong. Over the next 3 weeks, I would not just look at the board. I would find a way to flip the entire table. But first, I needed to figure out exactly where the rest of my money was going without him ever suspecting a thing. I parked my delivery truck 2 blocks away from Bradley's subdivision. I used the delivery job perfectly. My route covered the northern suburbs and the lakefront. I swapped shifts with a younger driver who wanted his afternoons free. This gave me the entire morning to watch my son. I parked my rusted box truck near the gated entrance of his neighborhood. I had a clipboard on my steering wheel and a faded uniform shirt that made me invisible. People do not look at delivery drivers. We are just part of the background scenery. I sat there sipping terrible gas station coffee and waiting. My back throbbed from hauling crates the night before, but the physical pain grounded me. It kept my mind sharp. At 9:45 in the morning, his pristine white luxury SUV rolled out of the gates. I put my truck in gear and followed him. Keeping a safe distance was easy in the morning traffic. I stayed 2 cars behind him all the way to the lakefront. He drove past the commercial districts and turned down a private access road lined with old oak trees and manicured hedges. I knew this road. It led to the Lakeside Yacht Club. It was a place where membership cost more than my house. I could not follow him through the main security gate in a commercial delivery truck. The guard would turn me away immediately. I pulled onto a side street parked near a public access trail and got out. The air coming off the lake was biting and cold. I zipped my thin jacket and walked down the gravel path that ran parallel to the marina fencing. Through the chain link and the tall decorative bushes, I had a clear view of the visitor parking lot and the private docks. Bradley had parked his SUV near the end of the lot. He was standing on the wooden boardwalk next to a man in a tailored blazer holding a glossy brochure. They were looking at a boat. Calling it a boat is a disservice to the machinery I saw. It was a massive twin-engine luxury cruiser with a sweeping fiberglass hull and dark tinted windows. It looked like a floating luxury condo. I pressed myself against the cold chain-link fence and watched my son walk up the boarding ramp. The salesman was pointing out the features, sweeping his hands over the teak decking and the premium leather seating. I could not hear their words over the wind and the crying seagulls, but I could read my son perfectly. Bradley was nodding, making expansive gestures with his arms, acting like a man who owned the world. He was pointing to the upper deck and laughing. That laugh echoed in my memory. It was the same laugh I heard at the country club when he called me a stupid old man. He was standing on a vessel that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he was buying it with the sweat from my brow and the blood from my blistered hands. I watched them tour the cruiser for 20 minutes. The rage inside me was a living, breathing thing, but I forced it down. Rage would not give me the evidence I needed. I needed details. I needed to know exactly how he was paying for this. I looked at his white SUV parked 30 yards away from me. The salesman had a small mobile office shed near the docks. I watched Bradley and the broker step off the cruiser and walk toward that office. The door closed behind them. The parking lot was empty. The marina was quiet except for the water slapping against the wooden pilings. This was my window. I quickly climbed over a low section of the decorative stone wall near the public path and dropped onto the marina grass. My bad knee buckled slightly upon impact, sending a sharp spike of agony up my thigh, but I ignored it. I limped quickly across the pavement toward Bradley's car. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. If the security guard drove by, or if Bradley walked out of that office right now, my entire plan would be destroyed. I reached the passenger side of the SUV and pressed my back against the cold metal door. I took a shallow breath and peeked through the tinted glass. Bradley was careless. He was arrogant, and arrogant men make mistakes. He had left the passenger window rolled down about 4 inches to let the lake breeze in. Sitting right on the premium leather passenger seat was a thick manila folder. The top flap was folded back. I stretched my hand through the narrow opening of the window. The cold glass scraped against my forearm. My fingertips brushed the edge of the folder. I pulled it upward carefully, angling it toward the gap in the window. I did not want to pull it out completely and risk dropping the papers everywhere. I just needed to see the front pages. I angled the folder toward the light. The first document was a purchase agreement from the yacht brokerage. The total purchase price listed was $285,000. The buyer was not listed as Bradley. The buyer was listed as a corporate entity named Apex Horizon Holdings, LLC. I stared at the name, burning it into my memory. Below the company name was an address registered in Wilmington, Delaware. There was a secondary document peeking out from underneath the purchase agreement. I used my thumb to slide the top paper down. It was a wire transfer authorization form. The funding account listed was the exact joint checking account I had been depositing my hard-earned wages into. He was wiring $40,000 in cash as a closing deposit today. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door of the broker office clicked open. I froze. The sound of Bradley laughing drifted across the parking lot. I shoved the folder back onto the passenger seat, letting it fall exactly where it had been. I pulled my arm out of the window and dropped into a crouch behind the front bumper of the SUV. The gravel bit into the palms of my hands. I heard their footsteps on the wooden boardwalk approaching the car. The broker was telling Bradley that the Delaware registration would keep the taxes low and ensure complete privacy. Bradley told the broker that privacy was exactly what he needed because he hated nosy relatives asking for handouts. I held my breath as Bradley approached the driver's side door. His expensive leather shoes crunched on the pavement just inches from my face. If he walked around the front of the car to check the bumper, he would see me crouching there in my dirty delivery uniform. I pressed my face against the cold tire and prayed. I prayed to a God I had not spoken to since my wife died, asking for just 5 seconds of luck. The car chirped as he unlocked it with his remote. He opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life. I stayed frozen on the ground as he backed out of the space, turning the steering wheel sharply. The massive tires rolled past me, and he drove away toward the exit gates. I stayed on the ground for a full minute after his car disappeared. My lungs were burning from holding my breath. I slowly pushed myself up, wiping the wet gravel from my hands. I had the name. Apex Horizon Holdings, LLC, located in Delaware. I limped back across the parking lot, hoisted myself over the stone wall, and walked back to my delivery truck. My mind was racing. I knew my son was stealing from me to fund his lifestyle, but creating a shell corporation in Delaware meant he was planning to hide this wealth permanently. He was building an invisible fortress with my money. I needed to know exactly how much had already been moved into that shell company. I finished my delivery route mechanically, acting purely on muscle memory. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I parked my truck behind the hardware store where I worked my second job. I called the store manager and told him I had a family emergency and would be an hour late for my shift. Then I drove straight to the main branch of my bank. This was not the small local branch where I usually deposited the cash. This was the central hub downtown where the senior managers worked. I needed someone with high-level access to look at the joint account and trace the wire transfers to that Delaware company. I walked into the polished marble lobby of the bank. The air conditioning was freezing against my sweaty uniform shirt. I approached the reception desk and asked to speak with a branch manager about a complex account issue. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a glass-walled office across from a man named Mr. Harrison. He wore a crisp gray suit and looked at me with a polite but condescending smile. He asked how he could help me today. I kept my voice low and steady. I told him I needed a complete routing history of all wire transfers leaving my joint checking account for the past 6 months, specifically any transfers going to an entity named Apex Horizon Holdings, LLC. Mr. Harrison typed my account number into his computer. He asked for my driver license to verify my identity. I handed it to him. He looked at the screen, and his polite smile slowly faded into a frown of confusion. He scrolled through the transactions and cleared his throat. He told me that there was indeed significant outward wire activity on the account. However, he noted that every single one of these outbound transfers had been initiated online by the secondary account holder, Bradley. Mr. Harrison folded his hands on his desk and looked at me with a suspicious narrowing of his eyes. He said that because these were high-value wire transfers directed to an out-of-state corporate holding company bank policy required a specific fraud prevention protocol. He told me it was highly unusual for an elderly account holder to suddenly request a forensic breakdown of transfers initiated by a family member. He asked me directly if I suspected fraudulent activity on the account. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. That hesitation was a mistake. Mr. Harrison leaned forward and told me that if there was any suspicion of fraud, he was legally obligated to freeze the account immediately and contact the other account holder. He said he should probably give Bradley a call right now, just to clear up any miscommunication before handing over detailed financial routing documents. Panic surged through my chest like a physical electric shock. If he called Bradley right now, the entire trap would be destroyed. Bradley would know I was investigating him. He would panic, empty the accounts completely, and disappear before I could gather enough evidence to destroy him legally. I could not let this manager pick up that phone. I forced my breathing to slow down. I channeled 40 years of teaching history and dealing with difficult situations. I put on the most tired, embarrassed fatherly expression I could muster. I let my shoulders slump and offered a weak, self-deprecating laugh. I told Mr. Harrison to please not call my son. I lowered my voice to a harsh whisper and told him a desperate lie. I said I was facing a severe IRS tax audit from some terrible mistakes I made a few years ago. I told him I was terrified that the IRS was going to seize all my assets, and I was just trying to figure out how much money my son had safely moved into his business accounts so I could know he was protected from my stupid financial errors. I played the part of the broken, ashamed old man perfectly. I told him I just wanted to make sure my son had enough money to survive my impending bankruptcy, and I was too embarrassed to ask Bradley about it directly. Mr. Harrison stopped reaching for his desk phone. His suspicious frown softened into a look of profound, uncomfortable pity. People in nice suits always feel pity for older men in dirty uniforms who admit to being failures. He sighed and told me that tax audits were a terrible burden. He said he understood my desire for privacy regarding my financial mistakes. He typed a few commands into his keyboard, and the printer in the corner of his office began to hum. He handed me a thick stack of papers detailing every single wire transfer. He told me he would not call my son today, but advised me to get a good tax attorney to handle the IRS. I thanked him profusely, maintaining my broken posture, until I walked out of the glass office and exited through the heavy bank doors. The moment I stepped out into the afternoon heat, my posture straightened. The act was over. I got into my truck and locked the doors. I sat behind the steering wheel and looked through the stack of bank documents. The numbers were staggering. It was not just the yacht deposit. Over the past year, Bradley had wired nearly $140,000 into Apex Horizon Holdings, LLC. He was moving my money across state lines into a corporate fortress that was entirely shielded from my name. I stared at the paperwork, and a cold, hard reality washed over me. I had the bank statements. I had the name of the shell company. I knew about the yacht, but I also knew I was completely out of my depth. Tracking cash deposits was one thing, but unraveling a Delaware corporate shell game and proving wire fraud across state lines required a level of financial and legal warfare I simply did not possess. If I went to the police now with just a few bank printouts, Bradley would claim the money was a gift. He would use his clean corporate image and his expensive lawyers to tie me up in civil court for years, while he liquidated the assets and laughed at me. I could not fight a corporate war with a history degree and a delivery truck. I needed a weapon. I needed a powerful ally who understood exactly how men like Bradley hid their money. I needed someone who could access restricted financial databases, someone who could draft legal traps faster than Bradley could escape them. I looked at my phone sitting on the dashboard. There was only one person I knew who had the ruthless corporate legal experience required to destroy my son. But calling him meant swallowing my pride and reopening a very old wound. It meant reaching out to a man who despised my blue-collar life almost as much as he despised Bradley. I picked up my phone and scrolled to the contact name. I was about to invite a shark into the water, but it was the only way to ensure my son was eaten alive. I drove my rusted Ford pickup truck into the heart of the downtown financial district the next morning. The towering glass skyscrapers blocked out the sun, casting deep shadows over the busy streets. I felt completely out of place. My truck coughed and sputtered as I pulled into the underground parking garage of the most expensive commercial building in the city. The parking attendant looked at my vehicle with open disgust, before handing me a ticket that cost more than I made in 2 hours at the hardware store. I parked next to a row of sleek black town cars and took a deep breath. My bad knee throbbed from the fall at the country club, but I forced myself to walk with a straight spine. I was going to see Jonathan Hayes. Jonathan was Sarah's older brother. He was a senior partner at a massive corporate law firm that occupied the top 3 floors of the building. Jonathan came from old generational wealth. He wore suits that cost more than my first car, and he had always made his opinion of me very clear. To him, I was just a blue-collar public school teacher who had failed to build any real wealth. He tolerated my presence at family Thanksgiving dinners, but he never respected me. Approaching him was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. It meant swallowing every ounce of my pride. It meant walking into the lion's den and admitting that I had been completely fooled by my own son. But I had no choice. The bank manager had proven that Bradley was using complex corporate legal structures in Delaware. I needed a shark, and Jonathan was the biggest shark in the city. I took the polished chrome elevator to the 42nd floor. The doors opened into a massive reception area made of imported white marble and dark oak. A receptionist sitting behind a sleek, curved desk looked up at me. She took in my faded khaki pants and my scuffed work boots. Her smile was polite, but completely hollow. She asked if I was lost. I told her my name and said I needed 5 minutes with Jonathan Hayes regarding a family emergency. She hesitated, typing something into her computer before picking up a phone and whispering into it. A few moments later, a young assistant in a sharp suit appeared and told me to follow him. We walked down a long hallway lined with abstract art and glass-walled conference rooms. We finally reached a massive corner office with panoramic views of the city skyline. Jonathan was sitting behind a custom mahogany desk reading a legal brief. He did not look up when I walked in. The assistant closed the heavy wooden door behind me, leaving us entirely alone. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. Jonathan finally slowly lowered his papers and looked at me. He took off his expensive reading glasses and sighed, leaning back in his leather chair. He did not offer me a seat. He asked me what on earth I was doing in his office in the middle of his workday. His voice was dripping with condescension. I walked forward and stood directly in front of his desk. I pulled the thick, folded manila envelope out of my jacket pocket and placed it gently on the polished wood. I told him I needed his legal help to stop a massive financial fraud. Jonathan scoffed. He picked up a gold pen and started twirling it in his fingers. He told me that his hourly billing rate was $900, and he seriously doubted a retired football coach could afford his retainer. He told me to take my little money problems to a local storefront lawyer. I kept my voice steady, holding my temper in check. I told him this was not about me. I told him this was about Sarah and the boys. That caught his attention. He stopped twirling the pen and narrowed his cold blue eyes. He told me to speak quickly. I opened the envelope and spread the bank printouts across his desk. I pointed to the wire transfers. I explained how Bradley had fabricated a story about a violent sports betting debt. I explained how I had been working 4 physical jobs day and night, depositing my wages into a joint account to save his life. Then I pointed to the outbound transfers to Apex Horizon Holdings in Delaware. I told Jonathan about following Bradley to the marina and seeing the purchase agreement for a $285,000 luxury yacht. I laid out the entire timeline of my son's deception. Jonathan stared at the papers for a long moment. Then he did exactly what I feared he would do. He laughed. It was a short, harsh laugh, devoid of any humor. He pushed the bank statements back toward me with the tip of his gold pen. He stood up from his chair and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city. He told me I was out of my mind. He said Bradley was a highly successful financial consultant who provided an incredible life for his sister. He said Sarah lived in a gorgeous gated community, drove a safe luxury car, and wanted for absolutely nothing. Jonathan turned around and glared at me. He accused me of being a bitter, jealous old man. He said I spent my whole life making mediocre wages, and now I was projecting my financial insecurities onto my successful son. I felt the blood rushing to my face. I gripped the edge of his mahogany desk and told him to look at the routing numbers. I told him the evidence of the shell company was right in front of his eyes. Jonathan slammed his hands flat on the desk, leaning aggressively toward my face. He told me that wealthy men move money through Delaware all the time for tax purposes. He said it was standard corporate practice, not a criminal conspiracy. He told me that if I was stupid enough to hand my money over to a grown man, that was my own pathetic fault. He said he would absolutely not allow me to drag his sister into my paranoid delusions. He warned me that if I ever tried to poison Sarah's mind with these lies, he would personally use the full power of his law firm to bury me in defamation lawsuits until I died penniless in a state-run nursing home. He pointed toward the heavy wooden door and ordered me to get out of his office before he called building security. The conflict in the room was boiling over. He was aggressively protecting his sister's perfectly constructed reality, refusing to see the truth right in front of him. I realized in that exact moment that appealing to Jonathan's logic or his sense of family duty was entirely useless. The only thing Jonathan cared about more than his sister was his own massive ego. I had to hit him where he was completely vulnerable. I had to show him that he was being played for a fool just like I was. I did not move toward the door. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. When I was standing in the freezing rain on the patio of that country club listening to my son destroy my life, I had pressed the record button on my phone. I needed it to make sure I was not losing my mind. I needed to capture the exact sound of his betrayal. I looked Jonathan dead in the eyes and tapped the screen. I turned the volume all the way up and placed the phone flat on the center of his desk. The audio was slightly muffled by the rain, but the voices were completely clear. Bradley's arrogant voice echoed off the glass walls of the office. First came the part where Bradley called me the most reliable automated teller machine in Ohio. I watched Jonathan's face. He remained completely stone-faced, showing no sympathy for my humiliation. But then the recording continued. On the audio, one of Bradley's friends asked him how he managed to keep his rich brother-in-law off his back. The friend asked if Jonathan was getting suspicious about where all the seed money was coming from. Bradley's laughter filled the silent office. Then Bradley spoke the words that would change everything. On the recording, Bradley said Jonathan was nothing but a stuck-up trust fund baby who thought he was a genius just because he was born on third base. Bradley bragged to his friends, saying Jonathan is so incredibly arrogant, he never bothers to look at the actual ledgers. Bradley said he was using Sarah's family name and Jonathan's country club connections to siphon money out of their father-in-law's estate planning funds. Bradley laughed again and said Jonathan is a brilliant lawyer, but he is entirely blind when you flatter his ego. He called Jonathan a useful idiot in a very expensive suit. I reached forward and stopped the recording. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents in the ceiling. I watched the transformation happen in real time. The dismissive, arrogant lawyer completely vanished. The skin on Jonathan's face pulled tight over his cheekbones. His jaw locked so hard I could see the muscles jumping under his skin. His eyes lost all their mocking superiority and turned into something dark and profoundly dangerous. Men like Jonathan Hayes do not tolerate being mocked. They do not tolerate being called useful idiots by men they consider to be their social inferiors. And they absolutely do not tolerate someone stealing from their family's estate. Jonathan slowly lowered himself back into his leather chair. He did not yell. He did not throw anything. His movements became incredibly deliberate and precise. He picked up his gold pen and gently set it down perfectly parallel to the edge of his legal pad. He looked at me, and his voice was barely more than a dry whisper. He said he was going to destroy him. I let out a slow breath, holding my ground. I told Jonathan I did not just want to embarrass him. I told him I wanted everything. I wanted my stolen money back, I wanted the hidden assets frozen, and I wanted Bradley left with absolutely nothing. I said I needed someone who knew how to trap him legally before he could liquidate the accounts and run. Jonathan stared at the bank printouts on his desk. This time he actually read them. His sharp mind was already assembling the pieces of the puzzle. He told me that we were going to do this, but we were going to do it exactly his way. He said there would be no emotional outbursts, no dramatic confrontations, and no warnings. He said if we were going to trap a rat, we had to lock all the exits first. He picked up his desk phone and hit a speed dial button. He spoke into the receiver, ordering his senior paralegal and his lead private investigator to clear their schedules and come to his office immediately. He hung up the phone and looked back at me. He said Bradley thought he was a genius for hiding behind a Delaware LLC. Jonathan promised me that by tomorrow morning, He would know what Bradley had for breakfast 3 years ago. I finally sat down in one of the leather guest chairs. The tension in my lower back eased just a fraction. I had secured my weapon. I had pointed the most ruthless corporate lawyer in the city directly at my son's throat. 10 minutes later, a tall man in a plain gray suit walked into the office, carrying an encrypted laptop. This was Jonathan's private investigator. Jonathan handed him the routing numbers and the name Apex Horizon Holdings. He told the investigator he wanted a complete forensic background sweep on Bradley. He wanted property records, offshore accounts, secondary tax filings, and anything tied to Sarah's name. The investigator sat on the leather sofa, opened his laptop, and started working. For 45 minutes, the room was entirely silent, except for the rapid clicking of keys. I sat there drinking a glass of water Jonathan's assistant had brought in. The reality of what I was doing was settling heavily on my chest. I was actively working to destroy my only child's life. But every time I felt a pang of guilt, I remembered the brand new golf club sitting in his hallway while I stood in the freezing rain with bleeding hands. Suddenly, the investigator stopped typing. He let out a low, sharp whistle. He looked up from the glowing screen and stared directly at Jonathan. The investigator said they had a massive problem. He turned the laptop around and slid it across the glass coffee table so Jonathan and I could see the screen. Jonathan leaned forward and read the data. His face went completely pale. He swore under his breath a harsh curse that shattered the professional atmosphere of the room. I stood up and walked over to the table. I asked what it was. I asked if Bradley had already bought the boat. Jonathan looked up at me with eyes full of genuine horror. He told me to forget about the boat. He pointed to a series of scanned documents on the screen. He told me the boat was just a distraction. Jonathan explained that according to the county registry database, Bradley had recently taken out a massive second mortgage, but it was not on his own luxury home. Jonathan tapped the screen. He told me that Bradley had somehow bypassed the legal safeguards and taken out a $400,000 loan against my own house. The modest 2-bedroom home I had lived in for 40 years, the home where my wife had died. The room started to spin. I felt the air leave my lungs. Jonathan kept speaking, his voice urgent and tight. He said the loan was scheduled to finalize and fund in exactly 14 days. If that money cleared, Bradley would transfer it directly into his untraceable Delaware shell company. He would leave the state with almost $1 million in stolen cash, leaving Sarah completely abandoned, and leaving me to face immediate foreclosure and homelessness. My son was not just stealing my wages. He had quietly and methodically put a noose around my neck, and in exactly 2 weeks he was going to kick the chair out from under me. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the computer fan spinning on the glass coffee table. Jonathan stood completely frozen, staring at the glowing screen. I had just learned that my son had secretly taken out a loan against my modest home, but the private investigator was not finished. The investigator did not look up. He kept his eyes locked on his keyboard as his fingers flew across the keys, pulling up another set of encrypted county records. He told Jonathan to brace himself, because the loan on my house was just the appetizer. The real theft was happening right under Jonathan's nose. The investigator clicked open a new digital folder and maximized a document on the screen. It was a property deed. Specifically, it was the deed to the massive 4,000-square-foot luxury home in the gated community where Bradley and Sarah lived. I knew that house well. I knew that Jonathan and Sarah's parents had provided a massive cash gift for the original down payment to ensure their daughter was comfortable. It was supposed to be Sarah's safe haven. It was the home where my 2 young grandsons were currently playing, completely unaware that their father was actively burning their future to the ground. The investigator pointed to a recently filed lien on the property. He explained that Bradley had just executed a massive cash-out refinance. He had taken out a second mortgage on their family home for $600,000. Jonathan leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as he read the digital paperwork. He pointed to the signature line at the bottom of the page. He said his sister would never sign a document like this. He said Sarah was incredibly conservative with her finances, and she would never agree to leverage the equity in her children's home. The investigator nodded gravely. He tapped the screen directly on Sarah's signature. He said Sarah did not sign it. He explained that the signature was a digital forgery processed through an electronic document system. Bradley had used his own administrative access to her email accounts to intercept the verification links. He had bypassed the standard security protocols by using a deeply corrupt online notary public who was likely taking a cut of the loan proceeds under the table. Bradley had effectively forged his own wife's signature to steal $600,000 in equity from her home without her having any idea it was happening. Jonathan let out a sound that was half gasp and half growl. He was a man accustomed to absolute control. He spent his days in boardrooms dismantling corporate rivals with ruthless efficiency. But seeing his own sister financially violated by the man she slept next to every night broke through his polished armor. He grabbed a heavy crystal glass from his desk and hurled it against the far wall of the office. The glass shattered into 100 pieces, raining down onto the expensive carpet. His assistant opened the door a crack to check on the noise, but Jonathan screamed at him to get out and lock the door. I stood there feeling a strange, cold numbness washing over me. My son was a monster. He was not just stealing my wages to buy a boat. He was systematically liquidating every single asset tied to our family. He was draining my home, and he was draining his wife's home. The investigator continued painting the bleak reality of Bradley's master plan. He explained that the funds from the fraudulent second mortgage were currently sitting in an escrow account. The banking regulations required a waiting period for a loan of that size. The investigator checked the dates on the filing and announced that we had a ticking clock. The $600,000 from Sarah's house and the loan from my house were scheduled to clear and fund in exactly 14 days. 2 weeks. In 14 days, all that cash would be released directly into Bradley's control. The investigator mapped out exactly what would happen next. Bradley would immediately wire those funds into the Apex Horizon Holdings account in Delaware. From there, the money would become untraceable. He would finalize the cash purchase of the luxury yacht. But he was not buying the yacht to take his family on vacation. The yacht was his getaway vehicle. Jonathan sank onto the leather sofa, rubbing his temples aggressively. He asked the investigator where Bradley was planning to go. The investigator brought up Bradley's recent internet search history, which he had somehow acquired through his digital tracking tools. Bradley had been heavily researching offshore banking laws in the Cayman Islands and non-extradition treaties in South America. He had also been looking at long-term marina slips in the Caribbean. The picture was brutally clear. In 14 days, my son was going to drain every ounce of equity from our lives, wire the cash offshore step onto his luxury yacht, and disappear forever. He was going to leave his wife utterly abandoned. Sarah would wake up one morning to find her husband gone and her bank accounts empty. A few weeks later, the bank would come knocking to foreclose on her home because the massive new mortgage payments would be impossible for her to meet. She and my 2 grandsons would be thrown out onto the street, and I would be right there with them because my own home would be seized by the bank to cover the fraudulent loan he took out in my name. My son was planning to leave his entire family homeless and bankrupt just so he could drink expensive whiskey on a boat in the Caribbean. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal made my chest tighten. I thought about my grandsons. I thought about their little faces smiling at me when I brought them cheap plastic toys from the hardware store. I thought about Sarah, who despite her wealthy upbringing was a good mother who loved her children fiercely. She did not deserve this. Nobody deserved this. Jonathan suddenly stood up. His eyes were completely bloodshot, and his jaw was set like granite. He walked over to his massive mahogany desk and picked up his office phone. He looked at me and said the planning phase was over. He said he was calling the district attorney right now. He said he knew the chief of the white-collar crime division personally. He wanted police cruisers surrounding Bradley's house within the hour. He wanted my son dragged out of his home in handcuffs in front of the entire neighborhood. He wanted Bradley locked in a concrete cell before the sun went down. I moved faster than I had in 10 years. I lunged across the desk and slammed my hand down on the phone receiver, cutting off the dial tone. Jonathan glared at me, his eyes burning with pure rage. He demanded to know what I was doing. He asked if I was suddenly trying to protect my criminal son, now that the reality of prison was on the table. I looked him dead in the eye and kept my hand firmly planted on the phone. I told him I was not protecting Bradley. I told him I was protecting Sarah and my grandsons. I reminded Jonathan that he was a corporate lawyer and he needed to think like one right now instead of thinking like an angry brother. I asked him to walk me through exactly what would happen if the police knocked on Bradley's door today. Jonathan opened his mouth to argue, but then he stopped. His legal mind caught up with his anger. I forced him to play out the scenario. I said if the police arrest him today, based on these digital records, Bradley will immediately invoke his right to remain silent. He will hire the best criminal defense attorney in the state, using the money he already stole from me. That defense attorney will look at the loan documents and claim it is a simple civil dispute. The attorney will claim that Sarah actually did sign the documents, but she just forgot or changed her mind. They will argue that spouses share financial authority, and it belongs in family court, not criminal court. I kept pushing the logic. I pointed out that the online notary could easily be paid off to swear under oath that Sarah was present during the signing. I reminded Jonathan that Bradley would look a jury in the eye and say the cash I gave him was a loving gift from a father to a son. If we strike now, while the money is still in escrow, the courts will freeze everything. The assets will be locked in litigation for years. Sarah will be dragged through endless, grueling depositions. Her reputation will be destroyed. And because the burden of proof in criminal court is so incredibly high, a slick defense lawyer might just get the charges dismissed due to lack of direct physical evidence. If Bradley walks free, he will punish Sarah, and he will never let me see my grandsons again. Jonathan slowly lowered the phone. He knew I was entirely right. The legal system is incredibly messy when it comes to marital assets and familial financial disputes. Bradley had designed his fraud to look exactly like aggressive but legal financial management. Unless we had undeniable proof of his criminal intent, calling the cops now would just give him the opportunity to lawyer up and hide behind reasonable doubt. The investigator closed his laptop and nodded in agreement. He said defense attorneys love messy family disputes because they can muddy the waters indefinitely. He told Jonathan that to put Bradley away for decades, they needed a smoking gun. They needed a full confession recorded legally, or they needed Bradley to make a catastrophic unforced error. They needed him to physically commit a crime while being watched by independent witnesses. Jonathan walked back over to the sofa and sat down heavily. He looked at me, his previous condescension completely gone. He asked me what we should do. He was yielding the floor to me. For the first time in our lives, the wealthy corporate shark was asking the retired football coach for a game plan. I thought about the football field. I thought about how you force a confident quarterback to make a terrible throw. You do not just run at him directly because he will see you coming and step out of the way. You disguise your coverage. You collapse the pocket around him slowly. You take away his easy options, and you make him panic. When a confident man panics, he abandons his strategy and operates on pure reckless instinct. That is when he throws the interception that ends the game. I told Jonathan and the investigator that Bradley was operating on a very strict timeline. He needed the final closing cash to finalize the Delaware Shell Company and secure the yacht. He was relying on my continued wage deposits to keep his daily lifestyle afloat while he waited for the massive loans to clear in 14 days. He felt safe because he believed I was a blind, obedient workhorse, and Sarah was completely oblivious. I said we needed to force him into a desperate financial corner. We needed to choke his cash flow so abruptly and so violently that he would have to abandon his careful corporate fraud and resort to immediate, reckless criminality to get the money he needs. I told Jonathan that we had to make Bradley believe his entire house of cards was about to collapse if he did not take drastic action immediately. Jonathan narrowed his eyes, considering the strategy. He asked how we were going to do that without tipping him off that we knew about the massive loans. I looked down at my rough, calloused hands. I thought about the pain in my back and the exhaustion in my bones. I told Jonathan I was going to use the one thing Bradley despised most about me. I was going to use my age and my physical frailty. I told them I was going to completely break down. I laid out the first step of the trap. I told Jonathan that tomorrow night I was going to fake a severe physical collapse at the warehouse where I worked my night shift. I would make sure it looked serious enough to warrant a trip to the emergency room. I would call Bradley from the hospital bed. I would tell him that my body had finally given out. I would tell him I was physically incapable of working the extra jobs anymore, and that the cash deposits were stopping permanently effective immediately. I knew my son. I knew his greed. If he thought his reliable automated teller machine was permanently broken just days before his master plan was supposed to finalize, he would lose his mind. He needed my final $15,000 in cash to cover the immediate closing costs on the yacht before the massive loan cleared. Without my cash, the yacht broker might cancel the contract. Without the contract, his getaway vehicle disappears. Jonathan started to see the vision. He leaned forward, a dangerous smile slowly returning to his face. He said if we cut off his cash supply, Bradley will panic. He will not show compassion for his hospitalized father. He will view you purely as a failing asset. He will become aggressive and try to force you to liquidate whatever small savings you have left. I nodded in agreement. I told Jonathan that was exactly the point. We needed him to become aggressive. We needed him to step out of the shadows of digital forgery and attempt to extort me directly. We would set up hidden cameras. We would record every single conversation. We would document his extortion attempts in real time. We would let him dig his own grave so deep that no defense attorney in the country could ever pull him out. But there was one major obstacle remaining. I looked at Jonathan and told him that none of this would work if Sarah was not fully on board. She lived in the same house with him. If Bradley panicked, he might take it out on her. If he started acting erratically, she might inadvertently alert him that Jonathan and I were working together. I told Jonathan we had to tell his sister the truth. We had to show her the forged deed and break her heart before Bradley could break her life. Jonathan's face fell. Telling Sarah was going to be the most painful conversation of his life. She adored Bradley. She believed they had a perfect marriage. Showing her the forged signatures and the escape plans would absolutely destroy her reality. But it was the only way to protect her from the fallout. We agreed that Jonathan would arrange a meeting with Sarah the following afternoon at a neutral, secure location. We would lay out the ledgers, the forged documents, and the recorded audio. We had 14 days left on the ticking clock. The trap was set. The pocket was collapsing. Now, it was time to let my son show the world exactly what kind of monster he truly was. The plan required a performance. For 40 years, I coached young men on how to take a hard hit on the football field and how to sell a penalty to the referee. Now I had to sell the most important injury of my entire life. It was Thursday night. I drove my rusted truck to the freight warehouse for my midnight shift. The cold air bit through my thin jacket. My body was already genuinely exhausted. I had not slept properly in 3 days. I had stopped taking my blood pressure medication completely earlier that week to make sure my vitals would look alarming to a doctor. I needed a medical record that proved I was physically broken. I needed Bradley to believe the automated teller machine was permanently out of order. I walked into the massive concrete building. The fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead. I took my position near the loading dock. I waited until the shift manager and 2 other workers were standing near the break room door having a cup of coffee. They had a clear line of sight to me. I picked up a heavy wooden crate full of steel bolts. It weighed about 60 pounds. I lifted it to my chest, taking a deep breath. Then I let my eyes roll back. I allowed my knees to buckle entirely. I did not brace for the fall. I let my shoulder slam hard against the freezing concrete floor, and I let the wooden crate crash down beside me, scattering heavy steel bolts everywhere. The impact knocked the wind out of my lungs for real. Pain shot down my spine. I lay flat on the cold concrete, gasping for air, clutching my chest. The warehouse manager yelled my name and sprinted across the floor. He slid to his knees beside me, asking in a panic if I was having a heart attack. I kept my eyes half closed and let my breathing become shallow and ragged. I whispered that my chest was burning, and I could not feel my left arm. It was a lie, but my pale face and the cold sweat pouring down my forehead made it incredibly convincing. Someone shouted to call 911. Within 10 minutes, the screaming sirens of an ambulance echoed through the loading bay. The paramedics strapped me to a gurney and loaded me into the back of the ambulance. They strapped a blood pressure cuff to my arm, and the monitor immediately started beeping wildly. My blood pressure was dangerously high from stress, lack of medication, and the sheer physical impact of the heavy fall. The paramedic looked worried, telling the driver to step on the gas. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, letting the chaos happen around me. I was taken to the emergency room at the City General Hospital. Doctors swarmed around my bed, hooking me up to an electrocardiogram machine and drawing vials of blood. They told me I had suffered a severe stress-induced cardiac event. It was not a full heart attack, but my body was completely shutting down from severe physical exhaustion. The attending physician looked at my medical chart and asked me how many hours a week I was working at 68 years old. When I told him I was working nearly 80 hours across 4 different physical jobs, he looked at me with absolute horror. He told me that if I did not stop working immediately the next time I collapsed, I would be leaving in a body bag. He ordered me admitted to a private room on the cardiac observation floor for at least 2 days of mandatory bed rest. The trap was perfectly set. At 3 in the morning, the hospital room was quiet. The heavy wooden door clicked open, and a man in blue medical scrubs walked in holding a clipboard. It was not a nurse. It was Jonathan's private investigator wearing a clever disguise. He checked the dark hallway, then walked quickly to my bedside. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 tiny wireless cameras. He mounted one inside the plastic housing of the wall-mounted television facing my bed perfectly. He hid the second one inside a decorative tissue box on the bedside table. These cameras fed directly to a secure server at Jonathan's law firm. The investigator patted my shoulder, told me the audio feed was crystal clear, and slipped out of the room like a ghost. I was wired and ready for war. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the bright sun peeked through the hospital blinds. It was time to pull the trigger. I picked up my cell phone with a trembling hand and dialed my son's number. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding irritated and sleepy. He asked me why I was calling so early because he had a very important client meeting. He was probably just waking up in his expensive silk sheets. I made my voice weak and raspy. I let out a dry, heavy cough and told him I was in the cardiac ward at the city hospital. I told him my heart gave out at the warehouse, and the doctor said I was 1 step away from a massive fatal stroke. The line went completely silent for a few long seconds. A normal, loving son would immediately ask if I was okay. A normal son would say he was rushing to the hospital right that second. Bradley did not ask a single question about my health. Instead, his voice dropped into a panicked, desperate whisper. He asked me what this meant for the money. He asked if I had deposited the final $15,000 for the bookies yet. He said the deadline for the debt was tomorrow, and the dangerous men were threatening to come to his house. I knew the truth. I knew he desperately needed that exact amount of cash to cover the closing costs on his luxury getaway yacht before his massive fraudulent loan cleared. I let a single tear roll down my cheek even though nobody was in the room to see it. The sheer sociopathic greed of my own child was a very heavy burden to bear. I told him I did not have the money. I told him my small savings account was entirely empty. I whispered that the doctors told me I could not do physical labor ever again. I told him I had to quit the warehouse, the security job, and the delivery route today. I told him the bank was empty, and I was so deeply sorry that I could not save him this time. Bradley let out a vicious, cruel curse. It was not a cry of fear for his family. It was the enraged scream of a man whose luxury yacht was slipping through his fingers. He told me I could not do this to him right now. He said I was ruining everything he had built. He said he was going to come to the hospital and we were going to fix this problem immediately. He hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I lay back against the stiff hospital pillows and waited. The hidden cameras were rolling silently. The pocket was collapsing. My son was about to walk right into a federal crime on high-definition video. It took Bradley 2 hours to arrive. When the door of my hospital room swung open, he did not look like a worried son. He looked like a cornered animal. His hair was messy, and his eyes were wild and desperate. But he was not alone. Walking closely behind him was a short, heavy-set man wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit, holding a thick, black leather briefcase. This was the corrupt online notary Jonathan's investigator had warned us about. This was the man who helped Bradley forge Sarah's signature on the massive $600,000 home equity loan. Bradley marched over to my hospital bed. He did not ask the doctors about my condition. He did not hold my hand. He looked down at me, hooked up to heart monitors and intravenous lines, and his face twisted into a mask of pure emotional manipulation. He leaned close to my face and put on his best, terrified voice. He told me the violent bookies had called him 20 minutes ago. He said they were parked in a dark van outside Sarah's house right now, watching my 2 grandsons play in the front yard. He said they told him if they did not get the $15,000 by tomorrow morning, they were going to do unspeakable things to the little boys. He started crying, forcing fake tears from his eyes. He begged me to step up and save his children. I looked at him, my heart pounding a steady rhythm on the medical monitor. I played my part beautifully. I cried real tears of absolute betrayal and heartbreak. I told him I had absolutely nothing left to give. I said my bank accounts were entirely empty, and my physical body was broken. I asked him what he expected a dying old man to do. Bradley wiped his fake tears, and his voice suddenly became very calm and deeply calculating. He gestured to the heavy-set man in the cheap suit standing in the corner. He told me this man was a private financial broker who specialized in emergency loans for desperate family situations. Bradley reached into the black briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He laid them directly on my chest over my thin hospital gown. He told me it was a reverse mortgage agreement for my modest house. He said the broker had already expedited the paperwork and approved my property value without an inspection. All I had to do was sign my name on the dotted line right here in the hospital bed. He said the broker would instantly wire the $15,000 to pay off the violent men and save my grandsons from being hurt. He promised me he would make the monthly payments on the reverse mortgage himself once he got his life back on track. It was a masterpiece of extortion. He was using the imaginary threat of violence against my innocent grandchildren to force a hospitalized elderly man to sign away the very last asset he owned. He wanted to drain the equity from the house where his mother died just to cover the closing costs on his getaway yacht. And he brought a corrupt notary right into a cardiac ward to make it look completely legal on paper. I looked at the paperwork resting heavily on my chest. I read the bold print at the very top. It was an irrevocable transfer of equity. If I signed this document, I would essentially be signing my home over to a predatory lending company and the massive cash payout would flow directly into Bradley's control. The heavy-set notary pulled a blue pen from his pocket and clicked it. He held it out to me with a greasy smile. He told me he was a licensed state official, and he could notarize the signature right now to expedite the emergency funds and keep my family safe. I let my hand shake violently as I reached slowly toward the pen. I let my fingers brush against the cold plastic, and then I let my arm drop weakly to my side. I started coughing, a deep rattling sound in my chest. The heart monitor beeped much faster, responding to my intentional heavy breathing. I looked up at Bradley with wide, terrified eyes. I told him I was so confused. I told him the heavy medication they gave me for my heart was making my brain foggy, and I could not read the words on the page. I begged him to give me just a few hours to clear my head. I said I promised I would sign whatever he needed to save the boys, but I just needed to sleep for a little while, so my heart would stop racing. I told him if I signed it now, while I was this heavily medicated, the bank might review the hospital records, reject the contract, and the money would be delayed. Bradley stared at me, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth would shatter under the pressure. He looked at the rapidly beeping heart monitor, then down at the legal papers. He knew pushing a visibly confused, heavily medicated elderly patient in front of hospital staff could backfire and invalidate the lucrative contract. He needed the paperwork to look completely clean. He snatched the papers off my chest and shoved them aggressively back into the black briefcase. He leaned in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He whispered that I was being incredibly selfish. He said if anything happened to his boys today, it would be entirely my fault because I was too weak to do what a real father should do. He told me he would be back at 5 o'clock sharp, and I had better be awake and ready to sign my house away, or he would never let me see my grandchildren again. He turned around and marched out of the hospital room with the corrupt notary trailing right behind him like an obedient dog. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet room. As soon as the door closed, the shaking in my hands stopped entirely. My breathing slowed down, and the heart monitor returned to a steady, calm rhythm. I looked directly up at the wall-mounted television, where the hidden camera was resting silently in the dark plastic grill. Then I looked at the tissue box on the bedside table. We had it. We had the ultimate smoking gun. My son had just committed felony elder exploitation, attempted wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit extortion, all captured in crystal-clear high-definition audio and video. He had brought a corrupt accomplice across state lines. He had used severe threats of violence to try and secure a fraudulent loan from a hospitalized man. Jonathan had told me we needed Bradley to make a catastrophic, unforced error. Bradley had just handed us a federal prison sentence on a silver platter. My cell phone buzzed gently on the bedside table. It was a text message from Jonathan. It contained only 3 words. We got him. I closed my eyes and let out a long, slow breath of relief. The trap had snapped shut exactly as I planned. Bradley thought he was coming back at 5 o'clock to steal my house. He had no idea he was a dead man walking. But as satisfying as this legal victory was, the absolute hardest part of the war was still waiting for me. I had undeniable proof of my son's absolute evil. I had the financial records, the forged deeds, and now the extortion video. The legal case was absolutely perfect. But none of this legal maneuvering would matter if Sarah walked into the crossfire blind. Bradley would undoubtedly try to use her and the children as a human shield when the walls started closing in around him. Before I could drop the final hammer on my son, I had to destroy the illusion of his perfect marriage. I had to sit down with a woman I barely knew and tell her that the father of her children was planning to leave her penniless and homeless in less than 2 weeks. The financial trap was fully set, but the emotional trap was about to break all of our hearts. The doctors at the city hospital absolutely refused to discharge me on Friday morning. They stood at the foot of my bed holding my medical charts and arguing that my heart rate was still entirely unpredictable. They warned me that the stress event I suffered at the warehouse was a serious warning sign, and that leaving the cardiac ward could trigger a fatal physical collapse. I listened to their medical advice politely, and then I signed the release paperwork against their direct orders. I had just captured my son committing felony extortion on a hidden camera the night before. The financial trap was fully set, and the clock was ticking down loudly in my head. We had less than 13 days before the massive fraudulent loans cleared. I did not have time to rest in a hospital bed. Jonathan sent a black private car to pick me up at the hospital entrance. He did not want me driving my rusted pickup truck. He wanted to make sure I arrived safely and securely. I sank into the deep leather seat of the town car and watched the city buildings roll by through the tinted windows. My body felt like it was made of heavy lead, but my mind was sharper than it had been in a decade. We were moving into the most dangerous phase of the plan. The private car dropped me off at the secure side entrance of the Grand Plaza Hotel downtown. Jonathan had rented a private executive suite on the top floor. It was a completely neutral location far away from Bradley and far away from any country club gossips who might recognize us. When I walked into the massive suite, Jonathan was already there. He was dressed in a sharp gray suit, but he had taken his tie off. He had arranged the heavy oak dining table perfectly. It looked exactly like a military war room. The bank statements from my joint account were stacked neatly on the left. The luxury yacht purchase agreement was sitting in the center. The forged property deeds for both my house and Sarah's house were placed on the right. Jonathan had his encrypted laptop open, ready to play the hidden camera footage and the country club audio recording. He looked up at me as I limped slowly into the room. He asked if I was physically ready for this conversation. I took a deep breath and told him I was ready to do whatever it took to save my grandchildren. Jonathan had called his sister Sarah 2 hours earlier. He used a very clever lie to get her out of her house without making Bradley suspicious. Jonathan told Sarah he needed her help planning a massive surprise anniversary party for their parents, and he needed to look at some expensive catering menus with her in private. It was a perfect excuse that Bradley would never question. At 12 o'clock exactly, there was a gentle knock on the suite door. Jonathan walked over and pulled the heavy door open. Sarah stepped into the room wearing a beautiful beige trench coat and carrying an expensive designer leather handbag. She had a bright, excited smile on her face, completely ready to talk about party planning and flower arrangements. Her smile vanished the absolute second she saw me sitting at the far end of the long wooden table. I was still wearing the faded clothes I had collapsed in at the warehouse. I looked incredibly pale and exhausted. She looked back and forth between her wealthy brother and me with complete confusion. She asked what was going on and why her father-in-law was sitting in a hotel room instead of working his delivery route. Jonathan locked the heavy hotel door behind her. He walked over to her, gently put his hand on her shoulder, and guided her to a chair directly across from me. He told her to please sit down. He kept his voice very calm and very professional. He said there was no anniversary party. He told his sister that they needed to talk to her about Bradley and that she needed to listen to everything before she said a single word. Sarah sat down slowly, pulling her trench coat tight around her waist. Her posture became immediately defensive. I leaned forward and started speaking. I kept my voice soft and steady. I started by telling her the truth about the World Cup gambling debt. I told her how Bradley had called me weeping about violent Russian bookies threatening her and my grandsons. I told her how I had taken on 4 grueling physical jobs, working night and day to deposit $4,500 a week into a joint account just to keep her family safe. Sarah stared at me for a moment, and then she let out a short, nervous laugh. She shook her head and looked at Jonathan. She told him this was a ridiculous joke. She looked back at me and said, "Bradley does not even watch soccer, let alone gamble on it." She said Bradley is a highly successful financial consultant who makes a fantastic living. She told me I must be getting confused in my old age. I did not argue with her. I simply slid the thick stack of bank statements across the polished wooden table. I told her to look at the routing numbers. I pointed out the exact dates I had deposited my cash wages from the hardware store and the warehouse. Then I pointed to the corresponding outbound transfers. I showed her the luxury day spa charges. I showed her the monthly auto drafts for the luxury European car she drove. I showed her the massive transfers to the Delaware shell company named Apex Horizon Holdings. Sarah picked up the papers. Her eyes scanned the numbers. The nervous smile completely left her face, replaced by a deep, uncomfortable frown. But the human mind has a very powerful defense mechanism against sudden trauma. Instead of accepting the horrific truth sitting right in front of her, Sarah chose denial. She dropped the papers back onto the table, and her face flushed bright red with sudden anger. She stood up from her chair, knocking it backward. She pointed her finger directly at my face. She raised her voice, screaming that these papers were completely fake. She accused me of fabricating bank documents just to ruin her marriage. She said I had always been a bitter, jealous old man who could not handle the fact that my son was infinitely more successful than I ever was. She said I was completely obsessed with playing the victim because I failed to build any real wealth in my own pathetic life. She turned her absolute fury onto Jonathan next. She screamed at her brother, calling him a snob. She accused Jonathan of always hating Bradley because Bradley did not come from old money. She said Jonathan was working with me to try and sabotage her happiness because he wanted to control her life. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her cell phone. Her hands were shaking violently. She declared that she was calling Bradley right this second to tell him that his father and his brother-in-law were running a sick, twisted conspiracy against him. She unlocked her phone and brought up Bradley's contact name. The conflict in the room reached an absolute boiling point. If she hit the call button, the entire trap would be destroyed instantly. Bradley would know we were coming for him, and he would disappear with the stolen money before the sun went down. I stood up, ignoring the sharp pain in my chest. I told her to call him. I raised my voice for the first time, speaking with the absolute authority of a man who had coached unruly teenagers for 40 years. I told her to go ahead and call the man who called me a stupid old man behind my back. I told her to call the man who I followed to the Lakeside Yacht Club. I slid the luxury yacht purchase agreement across the table. I told her to ask her husband why he used my blood money to put a $40,000 cash deposit on a luxury cruiser registered to a Delaware shell corporation. Sarah froze. Her thumb hovered directly over the call button. She looked down at the glossy brochure for the luxury yacht and the attached wire transfer forms. The sheer volume of evidence was beginning to crack her reality. But she was still fighting it. She whispered that Bradley wanted to buy a boat for the family. She said it was supposed to be a surprise for the boys. That was when Jonathan finally stepped in. He stopped being a protective older brother and became the ruthless corporate lawyer I needed him to be. He walked around the table and stood directly beside her. He told her to put the phone down on the table. When she hesitated, he reached out and gently but firmly took the phone out of her hand. Jonathan told her the boat was not a family surprise. He told her the boat was a getaway vehicle. He reached over to the final pile of documents on the right side of the table. He picked up the heavy legal packet containing the property deeds and the loan applications. He placed them directly in front of her. Jonathan pointed a gold pen at the top page. He told his sister to look at the document very closely. He told her it was a cash-out refinance agreement for her home in the gated community. He explained that a $600,000 second mortgage had been taken out against the equity of the house where her children sleep. Sarah stared at the paper. Her breathing became incredibly shallow. She shook her head slowly. She whispered that she never signed any mortgage papers. She said the house was completely paid off, using the money their parents gave them for the down payment. Jonathan turned to the final page of the document. He pointed the gold pen directly at the digital signature line. He told her that Bradley had used his administrative access to her email accounts to intercept the digital verification links. He explained how Bradley had used a corrupt online notary to bypass the legal security protocols. Jonathan looked his sister in the eye and told her the absolute devastating truth. He said her husband had completely forged her signature to steal $600,000 in equity from her own home. Sarah reached out and touched the paper. Her fingers traced the forged digital signature. The reality of the betrayal finally broke through her psychological defenses. Jonathan did not stop. He had to show her the entire terrifying picture. He placed the forged loan documents for my modest home right next to hers. He explained that Bradley had also taken out a fraudulent loan against his father's house. Jonathan laid out the timeline perfectly. He told Sarah about the 14-day ticking clock. He explained that the money from both massive loans was sitting in a mandatory escrow holding period. In less than 2 weeks, those funds would clear. Bradley would wire nearly $1 million into the untraceable offshore accounts, finalize the yacht purchase, and completely disappear into the Caribbean. I watched Sarah's face as the true horror of her situation settled over her. Jonathan told her that Bradley was planning to leave her completely abandoned. When the banks came looking for the massive monthly mortgage payments, she would not have a single penny to pay them. She and the boys would be evicted and thrown out onto the street, and I would be right there with them, completely bankrupt and homeless. Sarah collapsed back into her chair. The designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and hit the floor with a heavy thud. She put both hands over her face and let out a sound that I will never forget. It was a guttural, agonizing sob of pure heartbreak. It was the sound of a woman realizing that her entire life, her marriage, and the father of her children were nothing but a calculated financial illusion. She cried for her boys. She cried for the future she thought she had. I walked over and put my hand on her shoulder exactly the way I had done for my own wife when she was sick. I did not say anything. I just let her cry until there were no tears left. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bloodshot, and her makeup was completely ruined. She looked at me and whispered an apology. She apologized for calling me a bitter old man. She apologized for defending the monster who had stolen my wages and ruined my health. I told her she had absolutely nothing to apologize for. I told her we were both victims of a man who did not understand the meaning of family. Jonathan poured her a glass of water from a crystal pitcher on the table. He told her they had a foolproof plan to stop him. He explained that we had Bradley on hidden camera attempting to extort my house from me while I was in a hospital bed. He explained how they were going to freeze all the marital accounts the exact second before the escrow money cleared. He told her Bradley was going to federal prison for a very long time. Sarah drank the water, her hands trembling violently against the glass. She looked at her brother and told him he did not understand how dangerous Bradley truly was. She said Bradley had a terrifying temper behind closed doors. She said when things did not go his way, he became incredibly aggressive and unpredictable. She was absolutely terrified that if Bradley found out we were building a trap, he would hurt her or try to take the boys away before we could stop him. Jonathan knelt down next to her chair. He promised her that Bradley would never see it coming. He promised her that his private security team would be watching her house 24 hours a day from the street. But then Jonathan told her the hardest part of the plan. He told Sarah that if they wanted to spring the trap perfectly and ensure Bradley could not hide any money she had to go back home today, she had to walk back into that massive house and look her husband in the eye. She had to eat dinner across the table from a man who was actively plotting to destroy her life. She had to sleep in the exact same bed as him tonight, tomorrow night, and every night until the trap closed. She had to act completely normal, oblivious and happy. If she changed her routine or showed any fear, Bradley would know the game was up. Sarah looked at the forged deed on the table. She thought about her 2 young boys playing in their bedrooms. A sudden cold resolve hardened in her eyes. The weeping mother vanished entirely, replaced by a woman fighting for her children's survival. She looked at me and then at her brother. She wiped her face with a napkin and nodded her head. She said she would do exactly what we needed her to do. She would play the part of the perfect happy wife, while we built the gallows for her husband. The net was closing rapidly, but the most dangerous game of acting was just beginning. I left the Grand Plaza Hotel feeling like a soldier, walking back to the front lines. Jonathan had begged me to stay in the safety of the luxury suite, but I completely refused. I had to go back to my house. The trap required me to be exactly where my son expected me to be. My home was a modest two-bedroom ranch-style house in a quiet working-class neighborhood. It was the house where my wife Catherine and I had raised him. Every single room held a cherished memory. I remembered teaching him how to tie his shoes in the hallway. I remembered measuring his height on the kitchen door frame. Walking back into that house, knowing my son was actively plotting to steal it from me, felt like walking into a graveyard. Jonathan did not let me go back unprotected. A week prior, before I even staged my collapse at the warehouse, his private investigator had spent a full 12 hours wiring my entire property. They installed military-grade night vision cameras disguised as standard motion sensor lights above the garage and the front porch. They placed tiny micro-cameras inside the wooden birdhouse hanging from the old oak tree in the backyard. They even mounted a covert camera high up on a telephone pole in the dark alleyway behind my property fence. Jonathan told me we had to be ready for anything because a cornered rat will always bite. The investigator had also reinforced my master bedroom door with a heavy steel frame and a deadbolt, turning it into a panic room. I was instructed to sleep in that room every single night and lock the heavy door the moment the sun went down. For 3 agonizing days, I sat in my living room and waited. The silence was heavier than the physical labor at the warehouse. Bradley was growing increasingly desperate. He called my cell phone 10 times a day, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails. At first he tried playing the loving son, begging me to call the corrupt notary back so we could save the family. When I did not answer, his tone shifted to aggressive guilt. He left a message screaming that if his children were murdered by the bookies, their blood would be permanently on my hands. Finally, his voicemails dissolved into pure, unhinged rage. He called me a useless, pathetic old man who was too selfish to protect his own blood. I sat in my dark kitchen listening to his voice echo from the phone speaker. I did not shed a single tear. The father who would have cried for his son died in the freezing rain outside that country club. I ignored every single call. I sent him one single text message saying my heart was failing and I was too weak to speak. I knew the complete silence was driving him absolutely insane. The 14-day countdown was almost up. The closing date for the luxury yacht and the massive offshore wire transfer was approaching fast. He needed my final $15,000 to finalize his getaway, and he knew I was the only weak link he could break to get it. It happened on a Tuesday night. It was raining again, a cold, miserable winter drizzle that kept all the neighbors inside their homes with their televisions turned up loud. I was sitting in my armchair in the dark living room watching the street through a small gap in the curtains. My bad knee was throbbing and my chest felt tight with pure adrenaline. At exactly 11:15, a pair of headlights turned off at the end of the street. A dark sedan crept slowly down the block and parked near the alleyway behind my house. I immediately stood up and walked down the hallway, locking myself inside the reinforced master bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching my cell phone. Jonathan had stationed a private armed security guard inside my house for the past 2 nights. The guard was a massive man named Marcus, who stood silently in the dark corner of my bedroom, holding a heavy flashlight and a radio. He placed his finger over his lips, signaling me to stay absolutely quiet. 10 minutes passed in complete, agonizing silence. Then the violence exploded. A heavy landscaping rock smashed directly through the front bay window of my living room. The sound of shattering glass tore through the quiet house like an explosion. I jumped in the dark, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Seconds later, the heavy wooden front door was kicked open violently, the deadbolt tearing right through the wooden frame. Heavy work boots stomped into my hallway. I heard two distinct male voices shouting aggressively. They were deliberately knocking over furniture and smashing things against the walls. I heard the sickening crunch of my wife's antique wooden display cabinet being tipped over and shattering on the hardwood floor. They were destroying the very last pieces of my happy memories. One of the men yelled out into the empty house, telling the old man he better pay his son's debts. The other man took a baseball bat and started smashing the drywall in the hallway. They were making as much terrifying noise as physically possible to ensure I believed my life was in imminent danger. They wanted to terrorize an elderly man so badly that he would sign away his home the very next morning just to survive. The heavy footsteps stopped right outside my reinforced bedroom door. The doorknob rattled violently. A heavy fist pounded on the thick wood. A deep voice yelled through the door, saying this was just a warning, and the next time they came back, they were going to visit the grandkids. I squeezed my eyes shut and held my breath. Marcus, the security guard, drew his weapon and stood perfectly still, ready to act if they managed to breach the heavy steel frame. But they did not try to kick the door down. The script Bradley had given them did not include actual murder. It only included psychological terrorism. After another minute of smashing glass in the kitchen, the two thugs ran back out the front door and disappeared into the rainy night. The house fell completely silent again, except for the cold wind blowing through the shattered front window. Marcus waited 5 full minutes listening to his earpiece. His perimeter team confirmed the dark sedan had driven away. He lowered his weapon and turned on the bedroom light. He told me it was clear. I unlocked the heavy door and stepped out into the hallway. My house was completely destroyed. The drywall was covered in massive holes from the baseball bat. The living room carpet was covered in broken glass and muddy footprints. My wife's antique cabinet was splintered into 100 pieces, her beautiful ceramic plates crushed to dust. The television was smashed, and the sofa cushions were ripped open. It looked exactly like the aftermath of a violent home invasion. I walked into the kitchen. My bare feet crunched on the broken glass. Sitting perfectly dead center on the kitchen island, completely untouched by the destruction, was a white envelope. I walked over and opened it. Inside was a single piece of notebook paper. The message was written in thick black marker. It said, "Pay your son's debt tomorrow morning, or the little boys will pay it for you." It was the ultimate emotional manipulation. Bradley had hired men to destroy his childhood home and threaten his own children just to squeeze the last drop of blood from my veins. He wanted me to find this note, panic call the corrupt notary, and sign the reverse mortgage at sunrise. 10 minutes later, a pair of black luxury SUVs pulled quietly into my driveway. Jonathan and his lead investigator rushed through the broken front door. Jonathan stopped in his tracks when he saw the absolute devastation in the living room. His jaw tightened and his eyes burned with cold fury. He looked at me standing in the kitchen holding the threatening note. He asked if I was hurt. I shook my head and handed him the note. Jonathan read the words and let out a harsh, disgusted breath. He told the investigator to pull the camera footage immediately. The investigator set up his encrypted laptop on the kitchen island, brushing away pieces of broken glass to make room. He connected wirelessly to the hidden camera network Jonathan had installed a week ago. We all crowded around the glowing screen. The investigator pulled up the footage from the front porch camera first. The military-grade night vision made the dark street look as bright as day. We watched the dark sedan park near the alley. We watched 2 men wearing dark hooded sweatshirts and surgical masks walk up my driveway. We watched them throw the rock through the window and kick the door open. The footage was crystal clear, but their faces were completely covered. The investigator said catching 2 masked thugs would not help us tie this directly to Bradley in a court of law. A smart defense attorney would just say these were real bookies, and Bradley was actually the victim of their threats. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. If we could not prove Bradley hired them, this whole terrifying night was for nothing. We needed undeniable proof that my son was the architect of this violence. The investigator smiled a grim, tight smile. He told me not to worry. He closed the front porch feed and opened the covert camera they had hidden on the telephone pole in the dark alleyway behind my house. He said criminals always think about the front door, but they never look up when they are hiding in the shadows. The alleyway footage started playing. It was time-stamped exactly 45 minutes before the break-in occurred. The screen showed the dark, narrow alley behind my property line. A vehicle pulled slowly into the frame and stopped. It was not the dark sedan. It was a pristine, white, luxury European SUV. I recognized the license plate instantly. It was my son's car. We watched the screen in absolute silence. The driver's side door opened, and Bradley stepped out into the freezing rain. He was wearing a dark rain jacket over his expensive silk pajamas. He looked nervous, pacing back and forth near the brick wall of my garage, checking his expensive watch repeatedly. 5 minutes later, the dark sedan pulled into the alley and parked directly behind his SUV. The two men in the hooded sweatshirts got out and walked up to Bradley. The hidden microphone on the telephone pole was powerful enough to pick up their voices over the sound of the rain. The audio was slightly muffled, but the words were unmistakable. Bradley pointed toward my house. He told the two men exactly which windows to break. He told them to make sure they smashed the antique cabinet because he knew it would break my heart and make me emotionally vulnerable. He explicitly ordered them to leave the threatening note on the kitchen island, where I would immediately find it. One of the thugs asked what they should do if the old man tried to fight back. Bradley laughed a cold, hollow sound. He told the men to push me down if they had to because my heart was weak and I would just stay on the floor. He said they just needed to scare me enough to make me sign the bank papers in the morning. Then came the fatal error. The undeniable proof we desperately needed to send him to federal prison. Bradley reached into the inside pocket of his rain jacket. He pulled out a thick white envelope filled with cash. He handed it directly to the taller thug. He told them that was $2,000 up front, and they would get another $3,000 when the reverse mortgage money cleared my account. The investigator paused the video perfectly, freezing the frame right as Bradley handed the cash over to the masked criminals. Bradley's face was completely visible, illuminated by the street lamp at the end of the alley. The exchange of money, the verbal instructions, the absolute premeditated intent to terrorize an elderly man for financial gain. It was all captured in high-definition video and audio. The investigator leaned back from the laptop and let out a low whistle. He looked at Jonathan and said it was a masterpiece of stupidity. He said they just caught a wealthy financial consultant paying violent felons to commit a home invasion and extort his own father. Jonathan stared at the frozen image of Bradley's face on the screen. The wealthy corporate lawyer did not look triumphant. He looked profoundly sickened by the pure evil his brother-in-law was capable of. Jonathan turned to me. His voice was dead serious. He said this changes everything. He said this was no longer just a complex white-collar financial fraud involving forged signatures and Delaware shell companies. This was now a violent criminal conspiracy. It was domestic terrorism against an elderly family member. I looked around my ruined living room. I looked at the shattered glass and the smashed drywall. My son had ordered thugs to destroy my home and told them to push me to the floor, knowing my heart was supposedly failing. He was willing to risk my actual physical death just to get the closing money for his luxury boat. The last lingering shred of paternal sympathy I held in my heart evaporated into the cold, damp air. He was a monster, and a monster needs to be put in a cage. Jonathan checked his watch. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. He told the investigator to make 3 encrypted backup copies of the entire video file and send them directly to the secure servers at his law firm. He told Marcus, the security guard, to stay stationed at the front door until sunrise. Jonathan looked at me and placed his hand firmly on my shoulder. He said the waiting was finally over. The 14-day escrow period was officially ending today. The $600,000 fraudulent loan on Sarah's house and the massive loan on my house were scheduled to clear the bank and deposit into Bradley's accounts at 9 o'clock this morning. At 10 o'clock, Bradley was scheduled to wire those funds to the offshore company and finalize the purchase of the luxury yacht. Jonathan said we were not going to let a single penny leave the state. He said Sarah was ready. The district attorney was ready. The family court judges were ready. We had spent weeks silently building an absolute fortress of evidence, while Bradley arrogantly believed he was the smartest man in the room. The closing date for the yacht was tomorrow morning. The grand finale of his master plan was just hours away. But he had absolutely no idea that when he walked into the country club tomorrow to celebrate his ultimate victory, he would be walking directly into a bloodbath. The financial trap was fully armed. The criminal evidence was secured. It was finally time to burn his entire world to the ground. The sun rose on Wednesday morning, shining brightly through the shattered front window of my living room. The cold rain had finally stopped, but the bitter chill remained inside the house. I sat in my armchair, wrapped in a heavy blanket, staring at the absolute destruction my son had orchestrated. The broken pieces of my wife's antique cabinet were swept into a small pile in the corner of the room. I had not slept a single minute. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the frozen video image of Bradley handing a thick white envelope of cash to the violent masked thugs in the dark alleyway. Today was the final day of his elaborate criminal performance. Today, the 14-day escrow period for the massive fraudulent loans officially expired. Today was the day he planned to steal nearly $1 million and disappear, leaving his entire family to drown in his wake. At 7 o'clock, my cell phone buzzed softly in the quiet room. It was a secure call from Jonathan's private investigator. The investigator was parked in an unmarked car 3 blocks away from Bradley's massive luxury home. He gave me a detailed update on my son's morning routine. Bradley had woken up early. He was dressed in a crisp white linen shirt and expensive tailored shorts, looking exactly like a wealthy man preparing to step onto his brand new luxury yacht. The investigator told me that Sarah had performed her role flawlessly. Despite knowing her husband had forged her signature to steal $600,000 in equity from her children's home, she made him breakfast. She smiled at him across the kitchen island. She kissed his cheek as he walked out the front door. It was the absolute hardest acting job of her entire life, but she did it perfectly to ensure he suspected absolutely nothing. Bradley drove his pristine white SUV out of the gated community and headed straight toward the Lakeside Yacht Club. He thought he had completely won. He believed that the violent break-in at my house the night before had terrified me into total submission. He assumed that at this very moment I was sitting in my ruined kitchen weeping and signing the reverse mortgage documents with the corrupt notary just to save my grandchildren. He believed his offshore bank accounts in Delaware were about to be flooded with stolen cash. He pulled into the marina parking lot with the absolute arrogance of a man who thought he was completely untouchable. The investigator stayed far back, watching Bradley walk down the wooden boardwalk toward the broker's office with a confident swagger. While Bradley was breathing in the fresh lake air, Jonathan and Sarah were walking up the heavy stone steps of the county courthouse. It was 8:30 in the morning. Jonathan had drafted a massive stack of legal documents overnight. He carried a thick leather briefcase containing an emergency ex parte motion. In the legal world, an ex parte order is a rare and incredibly powerful weapon. It allows a judge to make an immediate ruling without the other party being present or even notified provided there is overwhelming evidence of imminent criminal harm or immediate asset flight. Jonathan was not just filing for a standard divorce. He was filing for immediate sole physical and legal custody of the two boys and a total emergency freeze on every single marital business and personal asset tied to Bradley's name. Jonathan used his significant political connections to get them directly into the private chambers of a senior family court judge. Sarah sat in the heavy leather chair across from the judge. She was trembling with fear and exhaustion, but her resolve was absolute. Jonathan presented the staggering mountain of evidence. He laid out the forged property deeds, the fake digital signatures, the luxury yacht purchase agreement, and the routing numbers for the Delaware Shell Corporation. But the final piece of evidence was the absolute killing blow. Jonathan handed the judge a secure tablet playing the high-definition video from the alleyway behind my house. The senior judge watched the footage of Bradley paying masked thugs to violently destroy his elderly father's home. The judge watched Bradley point to the windows and give explicit verbal instructions to terrorize me. The judge looked up from the glowing screen, his face completely pale with shock and disgust. In family court, judges see a lot of greed and manipulation, but they rarely see cold, calculated domestic terrorism funded by a wealthy financial consultant. The judge did not hesitate for a single second. He pulled out his heavy pen and signed the emergency orders. He granted Sarah full immediate custody of her children. He signed the divorce injunction. And most importantly, he signed a sweeping federal asset freeze order demanding that the banks lock down every single penny associated with Bradley and his shell companies immediately. It was 9:15 in the morning. The legal victory was secured in the courthouse, but a piece of paper means absolutely nothing until it is officially enforced by the banking institutions. This was where the terrifying race against time truly began. The massive fraudulent loans on my house and Sarah's house were scheduled to clear the escrow holding accounts and deposit into Bradley's control at exactly 9:30. At 10 o'clock, Bradley had pre-scheduled a massive wire transfer to send all that cash directly to the yacht broker and the offshore accounts. We had exactly 45 minutes to force a massive corporate bank to locate the accounts, verify the judge's signature, and completely freeze the funds before they vanished into the digital ether. Jonathan ran out of the courthouse and got into his waiting town car. He dialed his senior paralegal, who was already standing physically inside the main downtown branch of Bradley's bank, holding a certified digital copy of the court order. The paralegal approached the bank manager. It was Mr. Harrison, the exact same condescending manager I had spoken to days earlier when I pretended to be a confused old man facing a tax audit. The paralegal slammed the emergency court order on Mr. Harrison's desk and demanded an immediate total asset lockdown. But massive financial institutions move like slow, heavy dinosaurs. Mr. Harrison looked at the sweeping legal injunction and immediately panicked. He told the paralegal that freezing multiple high-value accounts, including a Delaware corporate entity, required formal authorization from the Central Legal Compliance Department in New York. He said it was strictly against bank protocol to freeze a premier client's assets without a full internal legal review. Jonathan was listening on speakerphone from the back of his car. He completely lost his temper. He yelled through the phone, telling Mr. Harrison that if he allowed a single dollar to leave those accounts, he would personally sue the bank for aiding and abetting a massive criminal wire fraud. I sat in my ruined living room, listening to the entire situation unfold over a secure conference call with Jonathan. My chest physically ached with the pure stress of the moment. It was 9:45. The escrow funds had officially cleared and deposited into Bradley's checking account. The money was sitting there entirely accessible to him. At the marina, Bradley was sitting in the broker's office drinking expensive coffee, waiting for the 10 o'clock hour to strike so he could click the final authorization button on his phone and wire the money away forever. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. 9:50. 9:55. The paralegal was standing aggressively over Mr. Harrison's desk, watching the compliance department load the freeze order into the main banking system. Mr. Harrison was typing frantically, his face covered in nervous sweat. On the conference call, the private investigator at the marina gave us a real-time update. He said Bradley was pulling out his cell phone. He was logging into his mobile banking app. He was preparing to initiate the massive offshore wire transfer. If he hit send before the bank executed the freeze, the money would cross international lines, and we would never see it again. It was 9:58, 2 minutes before the scheduled deadline. Bradley tapped the screen on his phone, initiating the transfer of $900,000. At that exact same fraction of a second, the banking compliance department in New York finally approved the judge's emergency order. The entire banking system refreshed. I heard Mr. Harrison's voice on the phone let out a loud gasp of relief. He announced that the total asset freeze had been successfully executed across all linked accounts. The system was locked down completely tight. Over at the marina, the investigator watched Bradley through the glass window of the broker's office. Bradley stared at his phone screen. His confident, arrogant smile suddenly vanished. He tapped the screen again, pressing his thumb down hard. He tapped it a third time, his face turning bright red with confusion. The banking application had completely locked him out. It displayed a fatal error message stating that his accounts were currently frozen by legal mandate. The investigator narrated the scene for us in real time. He said Bradley stood up so fast he knocked his expensive leather chair over. He started yelling at his phone screen. The yacht broker looked incredibly confused and asked if there was a problem with the wire transfer. Bradley tried to pull up his secondary business accounts. Blocked. He tried to check his personal savings. Blocked. He even tried to access the joint account he shared with me. Completely blocked. The invisible financial fortress he had built with stolen money had just turned into an absolute concrete prison. Bradley rushed out of the broker's office and stood on the wooden boardwalk, pacing back and forth like a trapped animal. He hastily dialed the bank's customer service number. We could not hear what the representative told him, but we did not need to. We knew they were telling him that a federal emergency family court order had been placed on his entire financial portfolio. Bradley dropped his phone to his side. The reality of the situation crashed down on his shoulders. A family court order meant only one thing. It meant his wife, Sarah, was involved. It meant his perfect, oblivious victim had somehow discovered the truth and struck him before he could escape. Bradley did not know about the hidden cameras. He did not know we had high-definition video of him paying thugs to destroy my house. He simply thought Sarah had found out about the forged mortgage and panicked. His massive ego convinced him that he could still manipulate his way out of this if he just got to her face to face. He believed he could bully her into dropping the legal injunction by threatening to take the children away from her. He ran to his white luxury SUV, his face a mask of pure, desperate rage. He peeled out of the marina parking lot, his tires squealing loudly on the wet pavement. The private investigator followed him closely, giving Jonathan continuous updates on his exact location. Bradley was not driving back to his house. He knew Sarah would not be there. Today was Wednesday. Every single Wednesday at 11 o'clock, Sarah's wealthy family hosted a private brunch gathering in the executive dining room at the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was a long-standing, unbreakable family tradition. Bradley knew Sarah would be sitting there, surrounded by her wealthy parents, her prominent relatives, and of course, Jonathan. Bradley was heading straight to the country club to cause a massive public scene to humiliate her in front of her family and demand she release his stolen money. Jonathan told the investigator to let him go. This was exactly what we wanted. Bradley was driving blindly straight into the final trap. Jonathan told me over the phone that he was sending his private car to pick me up from my ruined house right now. He said the local police were already briefed and waiting on standby near the country club entrance. Sarah was already sitting in the private dining room waiting for the monster to arrive. I stood up from my armchair, leaving the broken glass and the shattered memories behind me on the floor. I walked to my bedroom closet and pulled out the absolute best suit I owned. I tied my dark tie with perfectly steady hands. My son wanted to play a high-stakes game with our lives. He wanted to destroy his father and abandon his family for a life of selfish luxury. He thought he was walking into that country club to demand answers and take back control of his money. He had absolutely no idea that I was going to be sitting at the head of that table waiting to hand him his total destruction. I arrived at the Oak Ridge Country Club in Jonathan's private town car. My knees did not ache as I walked up the wide stone steps. The heavy fatigue that had plagued me for the past 2 years was entirely gone. I was wearing my dark navy suit, the one I usually reserved for weddings and funerals. Today was a bit of both. I was attending the funeral of my son's perfectly constructed false life, and I was officiating the death of his marriage. The country club staff recognized me from my time working the freezing security shifts on their back patio. But today, they did not ask me to use the service entrance. Today, I walked straight through the polished marble lobby and into the executive private dining room. Sarah was already seated at the massive mahogany table. Her wealthy parents were sitting next to her drinking mimosas and discussing their upcoming golf trip to Florida. They had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. Jonathan sat on the other side of his sister, checking his phone for updates from his investigator. When I walked into the room, Sarah stood up and pulled out the heavy leather chair at the absolute head of the table. She gestured for me to sit there. Her parents looked slightly confused as to why the retired football coach was suddenly crashing their private family brunch, but Jonathan quickly assured them I was a very special guest today. We did not have to wait long. At exactly 11:15, the heavy double doors of the private dining room burst open. Bradley stormed into the room. He was a complete physical mess. The confident, wealthy swagger he had carried into the marina earlier that morning was completely gone. His crisp linen shirt was heavily wrinkled and soaked with sweat under the arms. His face was flushed bright red, and his breathing was heavy and erratic. He expected to find his wife sitting alone with her parents, so he could easily intimidate her and blame the bank freeze on some terrible misunderstanding. He completely stopped in his tracks when he saw me sitting perfectly calm at the head of the table. He looked at my tailored suit. He looked at Jonathan's cold, calculating stare. He looked at Sarah, who was not crying, but staring back at him with absolute steel in her eyes. Bradley tried to instantly pivot his strategy. He forced a wide, fake smile onto his face and walked toward the table holding his hands out in a gesture of absolute innocence. He addressed Sarah's parents first, apologizing for interrupting their lovely brunch. Then he looked at Sarah, and his voice dripped with fake loving concern. He asked her why she was sitting with his father. He told her I was supposed to be resting in my house. He took a step toward me, shaking his head with a look of profound pity. He told the room that I had been suffering from severe mental decline for the past few months. He said the stress of my medical issues had made me completely paranoid. He claimed I was entirely confused about my finances, and that I had been making wild accusations against him because my brain was failing. He looked directly at Sarah and told her that whatever crazy lies I had told her to get her to freeze the bank accounts were just the sad ramblings of a senile old man. He asked her to please call the bank right now and lift the legal freeze so he could fix this embarrassing family misunderstanding. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply unbuttoned my suit jacket and leaned forward, resting my forearms on the polished mahogany table. I looked at the man I had raised, the man I had bled for, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold, hard resolve. I told him I was not senile. I told him my mind was sharper today than it was the day I taught him how to walk. I reached into the leather folder sitting in front of me. I pulled out the massive stack of bankroting statements and dropped them heavily into the center of the table. The thick stack of paper hit the wood with a loud, solid thud that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. I told Bradley that the bank statements were not a misunderstanding. I told the entire room exactly what the statements proved. I explained how Bradley had fabricated a fake violent bookie debt. I explained how I had worked 4 grueling physical jobs until my body collapsed just to save his life. I pointed to the outbound routing numbers, proving he was funneling my blood money directly into his luxury lifestyle and his secret Delaware shell corporation. Sarah's parents stopped drinking their mimosas. They stared at Bradley, their faces pale with sudden shock. Bradley's fake smile vanished completely. He slammed his hands down on the table. He raised his voice, pointing an aggressive finger at me. He claimed those bank statements were completely fake. He said I was an absolute liar who was just trying to ruin his marriage because I was jealous of his financial success. He looked frantically at Jonathan, demanding that the corporate lawyer defend him against these insane accusations. Jonathan did not say a word. He simply reached into his own leather briefcase and pulled out the second piece of evidence. He placed the heavy legal packet directly on top of the bank statements. I looked at Bradley and told him we knew about the boat. I told him I followed him to the Lakeside Yacht Club and watched him tour his new floating luxury condo. I told him we knew he needed $15,000 to cover the immediate closing costs before his massive fraudulent loans cleared the escrow period today. Bradley's face went from flushed red to dead white. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at the legal packet on the table. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor blade. He told Bradley's wealthy in-laws exactly what was inside that packet. He explained the cash-out refinance. He explained how Bradley had used his administrative access to forge Sarah's digital signature. He told her parents that Bradley had secretly stolen $600,000 in equity from their daughter's home and taken out another massive loan against my modest house. Jonathan delivered the final crushing blow, explaining that Bradley was planning to wire all that cash offshore today, buy the yacht, and disappear to the Caribbean, leaving Sarah completely bankrupt and throwing his own children out onto the street. The silence in the private dining room was absolutely deafening. Sarah's mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Her father, a powerful retired corporate executive, stood up from his chair. His face was purple with absolute rage. He pointed a shaking finger at Bradley, calling him a pathetic parasite. He asked Bradley how he dared to steal from his daughter and his grandsons. Bradley was completely cornered. The walls of his invisible financial fortress had completely collapsed around him. But true narcissists never surrender. When the truth corners them, they attack. Bradley turned his absolute fury onto me. The polite, loving sun mask completely dissolved, revealing the snarling, desperate monster underneath. He lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table. He screamed that this was all my fault. He said if I had just been a better father and provided a real inheritance for him, he would never have had to resort to creative financial management. He said I was weak and poor, and I deserved to lose my house because I did not know how to build real wealth. He screamed that Sarah actually did sign the loan papers, but she was just too stupid to remember. He said he was going to hire the best defense attorney in the state, and he was going to sue all of us for defamation and take total custody of his boys just to punish us. He was banking on the fact that white-collar financial crimes are incredibly difficult to prove in front of a jury. He believed his word against ours would create enough reasonable doubt to keep him out of prison. I looked at him calmly. I let him scream. I let him dig his grave as deep as he possibly could in front of his wealthy, powerful in-laws. When he finally ran out of breath, I reached into my jacket pocket. I pulled out Jonathan's encrypted tablet. I placed it perfectly dead center on top of all the forged documents. I told Bradley that I completely agreed with him. I said creative financial management was very hard to prove in court, but I told him there was one thing that juries always understand perfectly. Juries understand violence. I tapped the screen of the tablet. The high-definition video from the alleyway started playing. The volume was turned all the way up. Bradley's voice echoed through the pristine country club dining room. The video showed him standing in the freezing rain, pointing directly at my house. It clearly played his voice telling the two masked thugs exactly which windows to break and ordering them to smash his dead mother's antique cabinet. Sarah's parents watched the screen in absolute horror. They listened to their son-in-law instruct violent criminals to terrorize an elderly man and push him to the floor if his heart gave out. They watched Bradley hand the thick white envelope of cash to the thugs, promising them more money when he successfully extorted his father's house. The video finished playing, and the screen faded to black. The only sound in this room was the ragged, panicked breathing of my son. I looked at Bradley. His eyes were wide with pure, absolute terror. The arrogance was completely gone. The confidence was dead. He knew instantly that the video was a direct one-way ticket to federal prison. There was no defense attorney on earth who could spin that footage into a simple family misunderstanding. He had just watched himself commit a violent felony on high-definition video. Bradley stumbled backward away from the table. His knees actually buckled, and he had to grab the back of an empty chair to keep from collapsing onto the floor. He looked at me, his eyes welling up with real, panicked tears. He started shaking his head, begging me. He called me Dad for the first time with actual sincerity. He begged me not to show that video to the police. He said he was sorry. He said the stress of his lifestyle had made him crazy, and he did not actually want those men to hurt me. He dropped to his knees right there on the expensive country club carpet, crying and begging for mercy. I stood up from the head of the table. I looked down at the pathetic, broken man crying on the floor. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I remembered standing in the freezing rain on the patio of this exact same building, listening to him call me a stupid old man. I remembered the blisters on my hands from hauling heavy crates at the warehouse to keep him safe from imaginary bookies. I told him I was not his dad anymore. I told him a real man protects his family, but a monster feeds on them. I told him he had completely consumed everything I gave him, and now it was time for him to starve. The social and financial execution was absolute. Sarah's father looked at Bradley kneeling on the floor with total disgust. He pulled out his phone and immediately called the country club manager, ordering him to permanently revoke Bradley's membership and ban him from the premises. He told Bradley that he would personally use his immense corporate wealth to ensure Bradley never worked in the financial sector again. He promised Bradley that the only place he would be wearing a suit for the next 20 years was inside a courtroom. Bradley realized that begging was useless. The panic in his eyes instantly shifted back into violent, desperate rage. He realized his money was gone, his family was gone, and his freedom was about to be taken away. He jumped up from the floor, his fists clenched tight. He completely lost his mind. He let out a feral scream and lunged directly at me across the dining room table. He knocked over crystal glasses and sent the forged bank documents flying into the air. He was aiming directly for my throat. The final violent confrontation had begun, but we were already prepared for it. Bradley lunged across the massive mahogany table like a wild animal cornered in a trap. He did not care that he was in a prestigious country club. He did not care that his wealthy in-laws were sitting right there watching him. He had completely lost his mind to the sheer panic of losing his stolen fortune. He knocked over crystal mimosa glasses, sending orange juice, and shattered glass flying across the polished wood. His hands were outstretched, aiming directly for my throat. Time seemed to slow down entirely. For 40 years on the football field, I had watched angry young men lose their tempers and make reckless, violent mistakes. I did not flinch. I did not even raise my arms to defend myself. I just sat at the head of the table and stared into the desperate eyes of the man who used to be my son. Before his fingers could even brush the collar of my suit, a massive shadow moved from the corner of the private dining room. It was Marcus, the heavily armed private security guard Jonathan had hired to protect my house the night before. Marcus had been standing silently by the double doors, waiting for this exact moment. He stepped forward, grabbed Bradley by the collar of his expensive linen shirt, and violently jerked him backward. Bradley's feet flew out from under him, and he crashed hard onto the hardwood floor. The sound of his body hitting the ground was loud, dull, and incredibly final. Marcus did not hesitate. He placed his heavy knee directly squarely in the center of Bradley's back, pinning him flat against the floorboards. Bradley thrashed and screamed, cursing at the top of his lungs. He acted exactly like a spoiled, entitled child throwing a massive tantrum because his favorite toy had been taken away. He clawed at the carpet and demanded that Marcus let him go. Jonathan simply stood up from his chair, adjusted his tailored suit jacket, and looked down at his brother-in-law with absolute cold disgust. Sarah's mother was trembling, holding onto her husband's arm, but neither of them said a word to stop the security guard. They wanted the monster restrained just as much as I did. Then the heavy double doors of the private dining room swung open for the second time. 4 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives walked purposefully into the room. Jonathan had coordinated this entire operation perfectly. He had handed the high-definition extortion video and the forged bank documents to the district attorney hours ago. The police were simply waiting in the parking lot for Jonathan's signal. The lead detective, a tall man with a stern face, walked directly over to where Bradley was pinned to the floor. The detective did not ask any questions. The investigation was already over before they even walked into the room. The detective told Marcus to step back. The 2 uniformed officers grabbed Bradley by his arms and dragged him roughly to his feet. Bradley's crisp white shirt was completely ruined, covered in dirt and sweat. The detective pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He looked Bradley dead in the eyes and read the charges out loud, so every single wealthy person in the room could hear them clearly. He announced that Bradley was being placed under immediate arrest for felony elder exploitation, wire fraud, digital forgery, and conspiracy to commit violent extortion. The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around my son's wrists was the most satisfying sound I have ever heard in my entire 68 years of life. It sounded like heavy iron doors slamming shut on his future. Bradley panicked. He looked desperately at Sarah, pulling against the officers holding him. He begged his wife to tell the police this was all a massive misunderstanding. He promised her he would cancel the yacht and give the money back. He swore he would be a better husband. Sarah did not shed a single tear. She stood up from her chair, picked up her designer handbag, and turned her back on him completely. She did not even give him the dignity of a response. Bradley then looked at me. His arrogant mask was completely shattered, leaving only a terrified, weak boy. He pleaded with me, calling me Dad over and over again, begging me to save him. I just looked at him with the cold, exhausted stare of a deeply disappointed coach. I told him the game was over and he had lost. The police officers turned him around and marched him out of the private dining room. But they did not take him out through the back service entrance where I used to stand in the freezing rain. They marched him directly through the grand main lobby of the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was the middle of the Wednesday brunch rush. The lobby was packed with wealthy local business owners, powerful executives, and all the arrogant men Bradley used to drink expensive whiskey with. Every single person in that building stopped what they were doing and watched in absolute stunned silence as the highly successful financial consultant was dragged through the pristine lobby in handcuffs, screaming like a madman. His carefully constructed social and professional reputation evaporated into absolute nothingness in less than 2 minutes. The aftermath of that morning was a massive whirlwind of swift and brutal legal justice. Because Jonathan and Sarah had successfully executed the federal asset freeze just minutes before the fraudulent wire transfers cleared, the money was completely trapped. The massive corporate bank, absolutely terrified by Jonathan's aggressive threats of a highly public lawsuit, immediately reversed the fraudulent loans. The massive $600,000 second mortgage on Sarah's house was entirely voided by the court because the digital signatures were proven to be forged. The bank was forced to absorb the administrative losses. Sarah retained full, absolute ownership of the home where my grandson slept safely every night. The reverse mortgage paperwork that Bradley had attempted to force me to sign in my hospital bed was handed over to the federal prosecutors. It became the central piece of physical evidence proving premeditated extortion. The authorities traced the corrupt online notary who had facilitated the digital forgeries. They arrested him 3 days later at an international airport as he was trying to board a one-way flight to Mexico. The heavy-set man in the cheap suit flipped on Bradley instantly. He offered a full documented confession outlining exactly how Bradley had paid him thousands of dollars to bypass the security protocols in exchange for a significantly reduced prison sentence. Bradley's expensive criminal defense attorney took one single look at the mountain of evidence against his client. He watched the high-definition video of Bradley paying the masked thugs in the alleyway. He read the corrupt notary's sworn confession. He saw the undeniable bank routing numbers tying the stolen funds directly to the Delaware Shell Corporation. The defense attorney immediately sat Bradley down and advised him to take a plea deal because fighting the charges in front of a jury would result in the maximum possible sentence. But true narcissists are completely blinded by their own arrogance. Bradley completely refused the plea deal. He genuinely believed he was smarter than the prosecutors, smarter than the judge, and smarter than the jury. He took the case to a full federal trial. It was the worst mistake of his miserable life. The trial lasted less than a week. The jury watched the extortion video on a massive screen in the courtroom. They listened to the audio recording of him calling his father a stupid old man to his wealthy friends. They saw the photographs of my completely destroyed living room. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on every single felony count. I was sitting in the front row of the courtroom when the judge handed down the sentence. The judge looked down from the bench and called my son a calculating, remorseless predator who weaponized the sacred bond of family for his own selfish greed. The judge sentenced Bradley to 15 solid years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. I watched the bailiffs lead him out of the courtroom in a bright orange jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles bound in heavy chains. He did not look back at me. He had lost his pristine white luxury SUV. He had lost his membership to the exclusive country club. He had lost his beautiful wife and his massive house. He traded his entire luxurious existence for a tiny concrete cell simply because he thought the old man was too weak to fight back. Justice did not just punish the guilty. It completely restored the innocent. Through the federal asset forfeiture program, every single dollar my son had stolen from my wages was forcefully seized from his private accounts and returned directly to me. I received a massive certified check compensating me for the thousands of hours I spent breaking my back at the warehouse, the hardware store, and the security company. The very first thing I did when that money cleared my account was officially and permanently retire. I drove to my 4 jobs, shook the hands of my managers, and walked away forever. My days of hauling heavy crates in the freezing rain were finally over. I used a portion of the recovered funds to hire a highly professional crew of contractors to fix my ruined house. They replaced the shattered front bay window. They repaired the holes the thugs had smashed into the drywall. They installed beautiful new plush carpeting in the living room. Most importantly, they built a custom solid oak display cabinet to replace the one my son had ordered destroyed. I carefully placed the remaining intact pieces of my late wife's ceramic plates inside it. My home was a safe, quiet sanctuary once again. But the greatest victory of all had absolutely nothing to do with money or property. Fast forward to a crisp Friday night in late October, exactly 6 months after my son was locked in a federal prison cell. The autumn air was sharp and smelled beautifully like fallen leaves and hot, salty popcorn. I was walking through the wide metal entrance gates of the local high school football stadium where I used to coach. The bright stadium lights blared overhead, cutting through the dark night sky. I was not walking alone. I was holding the small, warm hands of my 2 young grandsons. Sarah was walking right beside us, smiling and laughing genuinely for the first time in years. Her divorce had been finalized rapidly, and she had been granted sole legal and physical custody of the boys. Bradley was permanently legally barred from ever contacting them again. We walked up the metal bleachers and found our seats right on the 50-yard line. The local high school marching band was playing a loud, victorious fight song. The energy in the stadium was absolutely electric. My oldest grandson, sitting directly to my right, looked up at me with wide, excited eyes. He pointed down at the green artificial turf and asked me to explain the rules of the game to him. I smiled a deep, genuine smile that reached all the way to my aching bones. I leaned down and started explaining the offensive line, the defensive strategies, and the importance of teamwork. As I spoke, I realized that my chest did not feel heavy anymore. My heart beat with a steady, calm rhythm. I was no longer the pathetic, exhausted pack mule carrying the crushing weight of my son's imaginary debts. I was no longer a victim standing in the freezing rain waiting for scraps of affection. I was a respected, victorious grandfather who had stood directly in the path of pure evil and completely destroyed it. I had kept my promise to my dying wife. I did not let our boy ruin this family. I stopped him, and I protected the innocent people he tried to leave behind. The boys cheered loudly as the home team scored a massive touchdown. I put my arms around their small shoulders, pulling them close. We were safe. We were together. And the monster who tried to tear us apart was sitting in a dark cell exactly where he belonged. Looking back on this entire nightmare, I realized the most dangerous mistake a parent can make is confusing unconditional love with blind obedience. When someone you love constantly demands your money, your time, and your physical health while offering absolutely nothing but excuses in return, they are not asking for your help. They are actively exploiting your heart. I learned that you cannot save a person who is intentionally drilling holes in the bottom of the boat. Sometimes protecting your family means you have to be the one to throw the toxic person overboard before they drown everyone else. If my story resonated with you tonight, please take a second to leave a comment down below. Tell me, have you ever had to make the agonizing decision to cut a deeply toxic family member out of your life to protect yourself? Your story might be the exact push someone else needs to finally stand up and fight back. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of ultimate justice and dad revenge. Share this video with anyone who might be dealing with a manipulative partner or family member. Your constant support keeps this channel alive and helps me share these incredibly important lessons. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very final word. Your time and your attention mean the absolute world to me. Please remember that while this narrative is heavily based on true events and real emotional trauma, some specific names, locations, and minor details have been slightly fictionalized to protect the privacy of the innocent people involved. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and never let anyone tell you that you are too old or too weak to fight for the people you love. Good night and take care of each other, and take